12-year-old girl named Sarah woke up in the dead of night. She could hear her mother arguing with someone. Frozen beside her bedroom door, Sarah listened as her mother screamed repeatedly. Then there was a struggle, the sound of a knife being drawn from a drawer, followed by silence. When Sarah finally felt it was safe to step out of her room, what she discovered would alter the rest of her life. This is her story. Now, let's get into the video for today. There are going to be many people in this story, but don't worry. The two most important people you will have to keep track of and remember are Crystal and Sarah. But in order to understand who they are, we have to go back and learn about their family and where they came from. Today, I'm going to be telling you the story of Crystal K. Farham Perry. Crystal was born in a small town called Rumford in Oxford, Maine, on August 23, 1963. Her parents were Howard Farham and Grace Bartlett. But before I dive into her life, I want to introduce you to the matriarch of the family, Crystal's mother, Grace. She was known by everyone as Gracie. She was born on April 3, 1919, and grew up in Newry, Maine, outside of Bethel, about 30 minutes south of Rumford. Rumford had a population of 7,000, Bethel had a population of 2,500, and Newry had a whopping population of just 300 people. These are all rural communities in the mountainous region southwest of White Mountain National Forest. These towns are stunning in the fall. The trees in Maine turn beautiful reds and oranges, and there are tons of rivers, waterfalls, and hiking trails. By the 1900s, rural southwestern Maine was known for its farming, manufacturing, and logging opportunities. Rumford had a huge paper mill, and Bethel was known for its shoemaking and masonry jobs. Gracie grew up in a community in a time where you had to work hard for what you had, and everyone knew everyone else. It's easy to foster close relationships, and it's also easy for rumors to spread. Gracie had 6 sisters and 5 brothers, so they grew up having to take care of each other, and Gracie was the primary person looking out for herself. When she was only 17, a month and a half away from her 18th birthday, she got married to a 23-year-old man named Raymond M. Bartlett. He was a cook, and they moved in together. They were very much in love at the time, but they had their fights as well. Sometimes their personalities just clashed. Gracie was very particular about the way she organized her home. Perhaps you might call it a little OCD nowadays. But she really loved to have things in order and enjoyed interior decorating, gardening, and listening to music. She actually sounds like someone I could be friends with. But Gracie especially loved to go out and dance. She liked to let loose. She was pretty, and when she went out, she would catch men's eyes, which sometimes caused Ray to become jealous. Together, they had one child named Keith before Ray left for the Navy. While he supported his family, Gracie took care of their son and continued to enjoy all of her hobbies, including going out on the town while her husband was far away. Eventually, a rumor spread around town that she was cheating on Ray, and his parents believed this rumor. They convinced him to get a divorce, so Gracie sadly ended up moving back home to Newry. She lived with her parents for a couple of years, and during this time, she had her son, Richard. Her parents actually suggested that she put him up for adoption since Gracie didn't have a way to provide for him. That's hard, especially in those times, with the way people would end up judging women who weren't married. They would judge them pretty harshly if they had a child out of wedlock. Gracie's neighbors stepped up and eventually raised Richard, and he later ended up becoming the local milkman. But Gracie soon met another man named Howard Farham, who was in the army. They got married and moved in together just outside of Rumford. She spent the next years of her life as a stay-at-home mom and had 10 children with Howard. Yes, 10. You don't have to remember all of these people, but you will hear about a few of them. Her sons' names were Wendell, Wayne, Webster, and Walter, and her daughters were Betty, Carol, Gloria, Glenys, Loretta, who went by Tootsie, Gwendoline, and Crystal. Remember, I told you Crystal is important because this is her story and her family. Sadly, when Gracie was pregnant, she miscarried Walter, which was very traumatic for her. In the 1950s, attitudes were slowly beginning to change to understand what a miscarriage was, and that it wasn't a woman's fault. But many people either didn't know this or still believed that a woman was responsible. Even the name miscarriage makes it sound like a woman made a mistake. Back then, Howard blamed Gracie for the miscarriage and he took it out on her violently. Howard was a nasty person. He was aggressive, he was an alcoholic, and he spent most of his life in and out of jail. He and his friends would go around the town, just terrorizing people, committing petty theft and robberies. Not only did he hit his own wife, but he also went to prison for 5 years for forcing himself on one of his own daughters. Yet Gracie continued to visit him in prison, and it was hard being a single mom. Once he got out, Gracie got pregnant with Crystal, her final child, who this case is about, and she gave birth to Crystal when she was 44 years old. I'm telling you all of this backstory because I want you to understand the environment that Crystal was raised in, a community affected by rampant misogyny and domestic altercations. For Crystal's mom, Gracie, she was used to men controlling every aspect of her life. Fighting was the norm, and she herself would end up picking fights and rebelling against her husband Howard. She continued to go out to bars every Friday night, often meeting up with her ex-husband Ray. She and Howard finally decided to get a divorce when Crystal was only 5 years old, and very quickly, she remarried her ex-husband Ray Bartlett. I don't know if you remember, but Ray was also a controlling alcoholic, though he wasn't as bad as Howard, so she sort of did trade up, but Ray did not like children. That would be a red flag and a hard no for most women who already have children or want them in the future. Remember, Gracie had 10. One was from Ray back when they were married, that was Keith, and 9 were Howard's. Crystal grew up surrounded by her siblings in a tiny farmhouse, with not enough beds for everyone, not enough space, and not enough food. The kids would usually share a bed or go to a friend's house for sleepovers. By the time the kids reached high school, many of them left home to escape the toxic environment they were living in. Crystal's primary caretaker was actually her older sister, Glennis. When Crystal and Gwen, the 2 youngest, were toddlers, Glennis was 12 years old. She was the one worried about them like a mother would be, even though they were her younger sisters. When the little ones went roaming around the yard, Glennis was there to save them. Gwen almost drowned in the creek once, and when someone got injured while running around in nature, unsupervised, Glennis had to learn first aid and take care of cuts and wounds by herself. Gracie was just too overwhelmed. I mean, it was a bad situation for everyone. I'm not sure if Gracie wanted as many kids as she had at that point, especially since she was living with a man who didn't want kids, or if she honestly just didn't know how to handle everything. Poor Glennis finally became too overwhelmed by how much she had to do for her sisters. She left home at the age of 14, knowing the only way to graduate would be to prioritize herself first. Crystal was left alone with her sister, Gwen. Crystal was a sweet and fiercely energetic child, and she learned to survive by escaping. She would spend her days biking around town and swimming with Gwen, and both of them had fiery carrot-red hair. People actually assumed they were twins because they were close in age. It's true, sometimes they fought, as sisters do, but they always looked out for one another at school, and when they were at home, avoiding Ray's control as much as possible. He never got physical with the kids, but he did have ridiculous rules, like they couldn't eat in the kitchen, they were only allowed to take baths, and they had to be quiet at all times. So, Crystal got out of the house as much as possible, and she excelled in school. She was naturally charismatic, and she met her best friend, Linda, when they were only 8 years old. They spent a lot of time together, as much as possible. Their birthdays were only 6 days apart, so they would even celebrate every year together. Linda was one of those fun, social friends who would drag you out to all the parties. By the time Crystal reached high school, they were going out every weekend and having the time of their lives. Crystal loved music and dancing, just like her mom. She was one of the baton twirlers in her high school band, and she loved a good house party, so she could let loose and just lose herself in the music and new people that she was meeting. Crystal was at one of these house parties when she met her future husband, Tom Perry. She was only 15, and Tom was 18. He even had a girlfriend at the time, but the moment he locked eyes with Crystal, he knew she was the one. He walked up from across the room and started talking to her. Not only was Crystal drop-dead gorgeous, but she was also smart, funny, and easy to talk to. Crystal was super impressed by Tom's confidence. He was charming, good-looking, and a hard worker, and they were instantly smitten. Tom ended up breaking up with his girlfriend so he could start going on dates with Crystal. In some other states, it's actually illegal for an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old to be together, since 18 is the age of consent. But in small-town Maine in the 70s, this was legal, and it happened a lot. I know that things were a lot different back then. Plus, Crystal was in such a toxic environment, and once she and Tom started dating, it was a perfect chance for her to escape her own house and focus on her schoolwork. Tom had a trailer of his own, and she moved all of her stuff in with him. Her mom, Gracie, was not a fan. She didn't condone this. This was her baby, her youngest child. She was so stressed out about Crystal being so young, but she was mostly worried about what the town would think about her. She wondered if Crystal and Tom were having sex together. Gracie made a huge deal about Crystal living in sin, but Crystal was adamant that living with Tom was the best decision for her so that she could graduate and land a good job. Tom ended up going over to Gracie and Ray's house and telling them that he didn't want to live in sin. He wanted to marry Crystal. This upset Gracie even more. Her daughter was so young, she didn't want Crystal out of the house, even though it was a bad environment. But Ray gladly took over the paperwork to make it happen. I can think of a few reasons why he would marry off a 15-year-old girl, and all of them are cold and selfish. Maybe he didn't want another mouth to feed, or maybe he made some sort of deal with Tom. But it's what Crystal wanted too. She and Tom got married in Harrison, Maine, about 45 minutes away from Bethel, immediately outside the town of Bridgton. Now, Bridgton had a population of about 4,500 people, and this is where Crystal lived most of her life. It's a town with one traffic light and only several local businesses and a huge shoe factory. The town is touristy in the summer because it's near Pleasant Mountain, which has a ski resort. In the wintertime, you can see the mountain's trails that spell out the word love. The town is also where Stephen King set his novel, The Mist. It can get very spooky in those woods, but it's unique and a beautiful area. Crystal got married on June 20th, 1979, in a tiny chapel. The only witnesses were Tom's brother and one of his friends. Just married and in love, Crystal and Tom decided together that they were going to move out to California to make a new life for themselves. Gwen, of course, was pretty disappointed when she heard the news that her sister would be leaving. They had discussed going to Bridgton Academy together, but Crystal was ready for something new. She had grown up in the same town around the same people, and this was her first chance to be anonymous and live her life on her own terms. So they packed up and drove all the way across the country in one straight line to a tiny town called Brownsville in California, with a population of only about 1,000 people. He thought if he knocked on the door hoping for work, they wouldn't say no. Kind of reminds me of asking for forgiveness instead of permission, but Tom's dad had plenty of connections, so he was glad to set Tom up with a job servicing trucks in Marysville. Now, that area was bigger and more populated, with about 12,000 people. There, Crystal studied hard to get her GED. She was so successful that the high school offered her a job as an assistant teacher at the age of just 17. But Crystal hated the bigger city. It just wasn't her vibe. She liked living in a more simple area with a simple life, where she could deeply connect with the people around her and not have to worry about crime and her safety. The couple eventually moved back to Brownsville, California, close to Tom's parents, where Tom worked as a mechanic, and Crystal worked part-time at a cafe. She didn't have her driver's license at the time, so she got a bit stir-crazy. Tom was starting to go to bars, drink all night, and stay out really late. Crystal eventually told him she was homesick, and they decided they would move back to Bridgton, Maine. So just after a year and a half of living in California, Crystal returned to her family and friends. You never know what you have until you leave sometimes, and she quickly landed a job at Bridton Seago Shoe Shop, also known as Pleasant Mountain Moccasin. Crystal was so detail-oriented, and she worked really hard. Her job was actually to stitch shoes together, especially loafers and boating shoes. She was a natural. She had strong hands and very precise movements. She and the other women in the shop, including her friend Penny, who worked right across from her, would race to see who could complete the shoes the fastest. The average person could do about 5 bins of shoes a day, and Crystal, she did 6. So from 6 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., Monday through Friday, Crystal sewed shoes. The work was exhausting, as you can probably imagine, and it was easier to sew shoes while standing up. Sadly, over time, Crystal started to develop carpal tunnel, but she loved being able to provide for herself and found a strong sense of community at this shop. When Crystal finally turned 18, she found out that she was pregnant, and she was so overjoyed. However, she started to grow a little concerned about her living situation. Tom was working a lot, but he was doing a bunch of odd jobs. He was mainly a mechanic, but he dabbled in construction and carpentry work. Then every evening, he would go out to his favorite bar, Sulky's, and drink all night. He just loved to party. When Crystal told him she was pregnant, he was thrilled because he loved children and was determined to clean up his act. Unfortunately, Tom struggled to stay sober and went back to his old ways. He continued going out every night, leaving his wife at home. Crystal gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Sarah. The other person you're definitely going to have to know in this case. Crystal was the best mom. She tried her best to break the cycle of her own childhood trauma and truly provide for her child. Now, she didn't have many options when it came to daycare, so she had to rely on her mother, Gracie, to help out. In the mornings, Crystal brought Sarah over to Gracie's house, and after work, she picked Sarah up and played with her all night. Crystal would make dinner, they would watch TV together, they would dance, and they would read. Some of Sarah's earliest memories are sitting on the couch in the evenings with Crystal while she threaded her needles for work the next day. Unfortunately, Tom was rarely home, and his drinking horrified and frustrated Crystal. He was becoming violent and aggressive and would spend large amounts of money going out. One time, Crystal even asked him to please set aside some money for groceries. When she got home from work, she saw that he had spent all of their money at Sulky's, his favorite bar. She actually went down there and confronted him. They got in a fight, and Crystal ended up punching him in the face. Not saying it's right, but this woman was at her wit's end. They were having loud arguments every single night, and Crystal's anger would often get the best of her. Eventually, Crystal gave up on waiting for Tom to get it together. She filed for divorce, and Tom didn't even show up to court. For years, Crystal would talk about how much of a bad husband he was, but she chose to keep his last name. I'm sure part of Crystal still loved him. They had spent many years together, and he was still the charming, good-looking, motorcycle-obsessed Tom that she always knew. But he had fundamental flaws. For some time, Crystal made an effort to keep Tom in her daughter Sarah's life, at least so she could have a father figure around. Tom did make an effort as well. He would take Sarah for ice cream, buy her presents, but he rarely paid his child support. Since he worked odd jobs, mostly for cash, he didn't report the money he earned to the state. Even worse, he moved in with a woman named Teresa, who had substance issues of her own. She was violent and jealous. Teresa didn't like the fact that Tom had been married to Crystal and that they had a kid together. She ended up harassing Crystal for years. This was not something to take lightly. I'm talking about death threats over the phone, fighting her in bars. It got physical. It really wasn't a good situation, and Crystal was afraid that her daughter might come into contact with Teresa if she was over at her dad's. Crystal had a heart-to-heart with Sarah and asked if she really wanted to keep seeing her father. By that time, Crystal was dating a new guy, someone Sarah thought of as a dad, a father figure, so Sarah said it didn't really matter whether she stayed in touch with her biological father or not. The rest of her childhood, Sarah would just see Tom around town, but didn't truly connect with him until she was an adult. Now let me tell you about Crystal's new boyfriend. His name was Dale Martin. They met at a bar, and I won't judge because, honestly, there weren't too many places to meet someone in such a small town. Dale was calm and laid back. At first, Crystal moved into his house, which they collectively referred to as the dump, because Dale didn't have much money coming in. He had gotten a back injury due to a construction job, so he wasn't currently working. The house was a mess. He spent most of his days gardening and fishing, waiting for a settlement check to come in. Eventually, that check did come from his former employer, and he was able to buy a new house. Living with Dale, Crystal was able to actually buy her first car. It was a black Ford Tempo, and it gave her the freedom to visit her family and start to enjoy herself. Crystal and Sarah would go on long drives together, and Crystal would do what they called a car dance, which was basically jamming out to music and embarrassing her daughter. She would also quiz Sarah to make sure she knew all the cool songs and bands. The two of them would go on road trips to Portland, Maine, to collect sand dollars at the beach. Other times, Crystal drove all the way to Boston to visit her sister, Glennie, and see museums there. Crystal finally felt that she had the independence she had always dreamed of. It's so crazy what just having a vehicle, a means to get around, can do for someone. Sarah was thrilled to be living with her mom's new boyfriend, Dale, and having him as a father figure. He taught her about all types of trees, how to ice fish, and even though he didn't really like to be called Dad, Dale tried to be there for Sarah. But he had his own issues. He was growing illegal drugs down in the basement, and he would turn them into pills and then sell them. Crystal started getting really concerned that he was going to get caught. The grow lights in the basement made their electricity bill very high, so it was kind of obvious that he had an undercover operation going on. Crystal was afraid that the government would find out and that they would take Sarah away from her. Just like in the past with other men, they started to fight. Crystal and Dale began having these loud screaming matches, and it was always in the kitchen. But that wasn't the only place they got into fights. They even had a fight at a bar. Crystal was upset that night and began drinking. She ended up taking out her anger about Dale by going home with another man. When Dale found out, he accused her of sleeping with somebody else, so he made her go to rehab for her alcohol issues. Even though Crystal did not have a drinking problem, she knew she made a mistake and regretted that. But she didn't do it because she drank too much. She did it because she was upset. Unfortunately, this event fundamentally changed her and Dale's relationship, and he became increasingly violent towards her. Over time, all of the thrown plates and punched walls became too much. Crystal moved herself and Sarah back into her mother's house. At this point, it would have been about 1992. At the time, Sarah was 10, Crystal was 28, and her mother's husband, Ben Ray, remember him? Didn't like kids. He died in 1989, so he wasn't around anymore. Gracie thrived as a widow. Now she could do things on her terms and keep her house exactly the way that she wanted it. She painted all the walls orchid purple and arranged the towels and everything just the way she liked. Crystal moving in with her mom was a lot. And with Gracie, even though she gave her daughter a place to stay and loved her, deep down, she was a controlling and critical parent. She would scrutinize everything down to Crystal's outfits, and she would get mad at her for the littlest things, like adjusting the heat by just a couple of degrees or forgetting to replace the water in the refrigerator water jug. She criticized Crystal for even getting into a relationship with Dale, but then she also criticized her for ruining the relationship with Dale because she now had to move into her house. It was its own form of abuse, and it was really hard for Crystal and Sarah to live in that environment. They were finally relieved when Crystal was able to save enough money and get a government check to buy a home of her own. The new home was in Bridgton on Route 93, which was regularly used as a logging road. It was a single-family ranch-style home painted black and white, situated in a pretty isolated wooded area, though, at 135 Sweden Road. When the developers put in this house, they ripped out most of the trees and then just replanted two smaller ones along the front entrance. So, without trees covering everything, Crystal and Sarah actually felt a little exposed. You could see what the trees looked like on the road right past their driveway, with many of them removed. They thought, who knows if some random person could be looking at them from the street. But since this was kind of a remote area, they weren't too worried. However, being remote caused other fears. If anything happened to them, it would be hard for them to get help. It was a 5-minute walk to the nearest neighbor's home, and with all the death threats that Crystal was getting from Teresa over the phone and elsewhere, Crystal was cautious. She always made sure to lock and double bolt the door. But this house was an absolute dream for them. It was true independence, and together, Crystal and Sarah made a little life for themselves. They spent a lot of time outside, going on long walks along the road and buying a birdhouse for their yard. Crystal had freckles from spending so much time outside, and now that she was older, her hair had turned into this beautiful dark red auburn color. She wore blue eyeliner every day, which made her blue eyes pop even more, and she was really into fashion. She loved wearing those big white cuffed shirts, floral dresses, sunglasses, and flashy necklaces. Crystal liked wearing nice jewelry and really pretty perfume and going out and getting a perm. This home was Crystal's oasis, where she could really finally practice some self-care and be the best mom possible. Since Crystal was so young, people would actually mistake her and Sarah for sisters instead of mother and daughter. Sarah said they were like sisters too. They hung out all the time at the mall. They went to the movies together. They liked to go pick out a VHS tape, get some dinner at House of Pizza, which was only a 5-minute drive off Main Street where all the shops and restaurants were in Bridgton. And then the two of them would watch a scary movie. Their favorites were The Shining and Children of the Corn. Every year they dressed up for Halloween, Sarah as a pirate and Crystal as a vampire. Crystal actually loved true crime. She had books on Ted Bundy and the Manson family, even though she didn't let Sarah read them because they were too graphic in her opinion. On Thursday nights, they watched Seinfeld together. On Saturday mornings, Crystal cooked pancakes and bacon while Sarah watched Garfield, and every night, Crystal sang to Sarah and tucked her into bed. She truly sounds like a super mom, and Sarah was quoted saying that she always knew she was loved. And I want to thank Sarah so much for really capturing her life in her book, After the Eclipse, because it's where I got a lot of this information. Crystal was absolutely full of life and super down to earth. She was not religious, but she was spiritual, and she really enjoyed pulling cards from her deck of tarot cards. She appreciated the small things and the little moments she shared with her loved ones. She was closest with her sisters, Gwen and Glennis, and every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and summer she would spend time with them. She also spent a lot of time with her mom, Gracie, and at that point she couldn't drive, so Crystal would go over there, pick her up, and take her shopping. Even though her mom never told Crystal how much she appreciated those trips, because that just wasn't the type of person she was, she did tell others that Crystal being around made her feel a lot less lonely. Crystal was just that kind of person. She was generous, loyal, and devoted to her family. The only thing that weighed on her was a struggle to find a loving, supportive partner. She had grown up with a ton of misogynistic jerks, and she was just unlucky. I mean, when you live in such a small town, it's really slim pickings, even though Crystal was such a catch. It's sad, and this took an extreme toll on her mental health. She had anxiety and self-esteem issues. When Crystal turned 29, she started to go to a therapist so she could talk about her thoughts of self-harm, and it was that bad. She told her therapist she just felt unable to do anything by herself, and I think it is important to take yourself on dates. The next guy she met was Tim. He was a younger guy in his early 20s, and it was a long-distance relationship. They actually met through mutual friends, and Tim just wasn't ready to settle down. There was always something. He was still in school to become an electrician, and he didn't want to get married until he landed a steady job, which is reasonable. Also, he had some baggage. His ex-girlfriend cheated on him, so he had major trust issues, and he told Crystal he would never be able to tell her that he loved her. I mean, at least he's being honest, but at the same time, it can be seen as pretty cruel not to give Crystal a chance because of his past. But it was never meant to be. Crystal wanted a stable partner who she could marry and have another child with. She dreamed of being able to give Sarah a little brother. She was so happy when she met Tim, but they would have these intense fights because they just didn't see eye to eye in their relationship, and they ended up breaking up. But it was kind of an on and off relationship that took a little time to actually burn out. That year, in 1992, Crystal was still working full-time at the shoe shop when a new guy started working there. He was even younger than Tim. He was 19. He was tall, thin, and handsome. He had bright blue eyes, and she liked that he wore an earring. His name was Dennis, but he went by Denny, and he worked with the machines. He was known for throwing tantrums every day at these machines, which eventually got him fired. When they met, Crystal was still dating Tim, and Dennis was actually married, but they started hanging out just as friends. Dennis would do little things for Crystal, like fix her car or work on other things at her house. They flirted, but nothing actually happened until Dennis's wife cheated on him, and the two of them got a divorce. Crystal and Dennis got together after that, and Dennis adored Crystal. He came over every Wednesday and Saturday night and proposed to her on several occasions, but she was like, "I can't take this seriously. If it's for real, I need to see a ring." But as amazing as Dennis seemed to be, he also had a temper. I was hoping that he would be different, but they too started having fights regularly. Now, Dennis did buy that ring, and he planned to propose to Crystal on her 30th birthday. But that night, instead of sliding a ring on her finger, they got into an explosive argument. It went so far that both of them were just screaming and throwing things. They slipped into a toxic routine, and this just kept happening in Crystal's life over and over again with every man. Dennis actually broke the siding of the house, he punched the walls in, and he even totaled his truck after they got into an argument. He was controlling. He would convince Crystal to do things like cut off her beautiful red hair and make it really short and more masculine. And that is a huge sign of emotional control over someone in jealousy. Controlling someone's hair like that, a lot of the time, abusers use this as a way to diminish their partner's self-worth. And poor Crystal had already been through so much of that time before meeting Dennis. Now Sarah was 11, and everything she saw was pretty normal to her. She thought Denny was just being Denny. She didn't really consider him violent. He just threw tantrums, adult ones. But keep in mind, Sarah had seen her mom get into fights with Tom, Dale, Tim, and now Dennis. So this is sadly what she thought relationships looked like. Crystal knew their relationship wasn't 100% healthy, but they still had feelings for one another. Dennis loved to talk about the future, and he promised to build Sarah a treehouse, and the three of them would go on long walks and drives together, just enjoying each other's company. Now Dennis did eventually propose to Crystal, and she said yes. But in therapy, Crystal talked about her relationship with Dennis and how it affected her mental health. At her sessions, she discussed how to set boundaries with Dennis. If they were to really get married, their fights could not be so explosive. It just wasn't fair to her or to Sarah if he didn't get his act together. There were other fish in the sea, even though the sea is kind of small where she is. But being alone is sometimes better than being in this toxic environment. Sarah said this about her mom. In her romantic selections, she could have done better and she could have done worse. Crystal did everything in her power to make a great life for her daughter and to find the love that she herself deserved. On Tuesday, May 10, 1994, 30-year-old Crystal and 12-year-old Sarah witnessed a solar eclipse together. They always bonded over big weather events like that, and together they watched the moon partially cover the sun, marveling at how cool it was just to be alive. They had no idea what was ahead of them. Just like the moon had covered the sun and brought darkness to the earth, a blanket of darkness was about to come over their lives. The next day, Crystal went to work and Sarah went to school. They came home, had dinner, and did their normal routine. Sarah doesn't remember a single thing about it because it was so normal. It was an average day, automatic, easy, and natural. Then Sarah went to sleep, but in the middle of the night, she woke up to the sound of her mother screaming. Sarah was used to this. At first, she thought that it was just Crystal having an argument with Dennis. He usually came over on Wednesday nights, so it made sense, and the two of them were in a rough patch. But Crystal was screaming "no" at the top of her lungs, and she was doing it over and over again. She didn't usually sound this scared. Sarah wasn't sure what she should do, so she called out, "Mom!" Then she panicked because her bedroom door was still open, just a crack. What if this person fighting with her mom wasn't Dennis? And what if they looked in and realized Sarah was in there? She got scared. She didn't know who was out there. So she crept slowly toward her bedroom door. She couldn't see the kitchen from her bedroom, but it was right down the hall, less than 15 feet away. Crystal just kept screaming over and over again, pleading for her life with this person she was fighting with. Sarah shut the door, and when it clicked, there was the stark sound of someone stomping toward her. She scrambled back toward her bed and listened to the footsteps. She was expecting her door to open and be confronted by this monster with nowhere to go. But instead, she heard the sound of one of their kitchen drawers opening up. Silverware was being shuffled around and the metal utensils clanked against one another. Then she heard something being pulled out. It was a sliding sound, metal on metal. And then Sarah heard a loud, wet thud over and over again while her mother kept screaming. Later she would recount it as a gigantic fish, a 500 pounds deep-water sturgeon, wet and thrashing for air and life on the hollow kitchen floor. That is quite a description. She knew Crystal was being hurt by someone in the other room. And as a matter of fact, Sarah was sure that she was hearing someone killing her mother. But if she tried to come to her mother's rescue, she didn't know if she would be next. She didn't know who was out there. She didn't know what they had done to her mother. Sarah didn't know if this person knew she was there. Time just stood still after the thrumming noise. Sarah heard what sounded like a man's grunt, and then the sound of a phone beeping off its hook. She didn't dare move. Minutes passed in silence. She wasn't sure if the attacker had left the house, but she knew that she had to make her way to her mother if she had any chance of still being alive. When she felt safe enough, Sarah crept into the living room. The kitchen light was switched off. Everything was illuminated just by a nightlight. Sarah looked at the clock in the kitchen and noticed it was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. Then she turned toward the living room. There was her mom, wearing her favorite blue bathrobe, lying on the ground in a pool of blood. There was so much blood. In a state of panic, Sarah didn't know if the figure on the ground really was her mother. Her mind was racing. Sarah actually pinched herself to make sure this was real. She went up to Crystal's body and touched her calf. Her mom didn't move, and Sarah knew in her heart that this was too much blood, far too much blood. She knew she needed to call the police. Sarah noticed that her mother's hand was actually reaching for the phone. It was still in that position. She had tried to call for help and had accidentally knocked the phone off its hook. The receiver was lying on the floor right next to Crystal's body. Sarah quickly picked it up and dialed 911 desperately, but the line was completely blank. There was just silence. There was no one on the other end, not even a dial tone. So Sarah panicked. She wanted to save her mom. She ran down the long hallway to Crystal's room where another phone was located. She quickly punched in the numbers 911 and held the receiver to her ear. She waited for it to ring, but there was nothing. She called again and again, but she didn't know why it wasn't working. Sarah then prepared herself to do what she knew she had to do. Without any time to even put on her shoes, she ran outside in her bathrobe, all alone in the darkness, in the middle of the night, to find help. It was May. It was still cold outside and steadily raining. Little Sarah ran barefoot into the darkness, heading for the nearest home. Sarah knew the owners, the Demerits, in the house about half a mile away. Half a mile is far enough to be walking, but in pitch darkness on this rural road, it was a lot more difficult. When she finally got there, Sarah banged on their front door, yelling, "Help me! My mother's been stabbed!" She punched the door again and again, but nobody answered. Then she ran down the street for 5 more minutes to 2 other homes. She didn't know who lived there, but neither one of them answered anyway. At this point, part of Sarah was completely dissociated, and the other part of her was fighting to inform the police about what she had just seen. It seemed at that moment she was the only person alive because, in her mind, everyone in the world must be dead. She wasn't getting an answer, but she didn't give up. She ran another 10 minutes down the road through the dark woods before she reached the Wilsons' house. They didn't answer either. At this point, Sarah had run over a mile, and there was only one more building before the intersection of Route 302. That's where the town of Bridgton begins, and Sarah promised herself she would knock on every door in town until someone opened up. She'd even passed a small cemetery in the dark, but she could finally see the next building. It was a fancy Italian restaurant called Vezza, where the owners lived out back in a connected portion. The couple was still awake after closing up for the night and heard the knocks on the door. They immediately answered and were struck by the image of a 12-year-old little girl, soaking wet, out of breath, and covered in blood. The girl said that someone had stabbed her mother, and she was scared that they might be after her, so she needed to use their phone to call 911. Of course, the couple let her in and helped her call the police. The police were sent out immediately, and once they got on the scene, it was clear from her injuries that Crystal was already dead. It wasn't an accident. Homicide detectives were called in. By 2 a.m., forensic investigators arrived at Crystal's house and found the most horrific crime scene. There was blood everywhere. It's not an exaggeration. It was in the kitchen, the living room, all over the furniture, on the floors, and on the phone. Investigators took photographs and video footage of this crime scene. They were so brutal, I cannot show them here. But Crystal's entire face and head were covered in so much blood, you couldn't make out any of her features. There were also blood droplets, smears, and smudges all over her bare legs, and her robe was soaked in blood. Crystal just lay there on the linoleum floor in her kitchen, and there were portions of the carpet with blood sprays all over them. It left behind evidence of each time the knife went in. The investigators cut squares out of the living room carpet in order to compare the normal fiber samples to the ones with blood on them. The crime scene technicians removed whole portions of the couch with blood on them. Investigators tried to find fingerprints, but they only found some on the glass door. One full palm print that looked like it belonged to Sarah by the size of it, and one print with the very tips of the fingers. There weren't any other fingerprints in the house, which had been spotless before this killer came in. Remember, Crystal liked to keep her things in order, just like her mother, Gracie. There were boot prints everywhere in the kitchen, going in multiple directions. It looked like the perpetrator had tried to head toward Sarah's door, but never made it there. Maybe Crystal had distracted him so that he wouldn't get to her daughter. It also looked like the attacker tried to clean up some of the blood, and the investigators wondered why anyone would even try to clean up this much blood. But they had an idea why. It looked like the killer was racing back and forth through the kitchen, probably because they were cut. They were trying to clean up their blood and needed to find something to stop the bleeding. This left at least 20 of their boot prints on the floor in blood. They took samples of blood droplets on Crystal's legs and hip that looked different from her blood. By the way that they dripped, it looked like they dripped from someone standing above her. Also, these right here, the way they're round, those come from above and they drip straight down. They thought this could be the killer's blood, so they made sure to take samples to analyze it. This also narrowed down who they were looking for, someone with an injury, possibly to their hand. Blood, if you don't know, has the consistency of motor oil. It's very slippery, and as someone's getting that violent stabbing someone, they're bound to slip and cut themselves with the blade. The more times they make that motion, the more chances they have for that knife to slip, and there were multiple wounds on Crystal. There were also droplets on the kitchen counter near the paper towel roll. The killer stopped the bleeding because on the way out, there were no droplets. It was ultimately determined that poor Crystal had been stabbed over 50 times in the face and head alone. Just think about what a small area that is, and how many times someone had to raise and bring down a knife into her, disfiguring her. They could tell the instrument used was a sharp metal knife. She had been fatally stabbed in the chest. She also suffered defensive wounds, slices to her arms and her wrists, indicating that she tried to protect herself from her attacker. She had been stabbed so forcefully that the knife tip came off and was lodged inside her head. Crystal's murder had clearly been painful, and it was clear the area targeted was her face and her head. It's as though the killer wanted to erase Crystal's beauty, and it's just so sad. Right away, they classified this as a crime of passion because of the overkill. It appeared as though the struggle began in the living room area because that's where most of the blood was, and it went in a trail into the kitchen where Crystal's body was found. Now, this wasn't a robbery, nothing was taken, and they didn't find any evidence of forced entry. There's something worse I have to tell you. I don't even want to talk about this, it's so horrible. But Crystal's autopsy revealed that she had been violently, and I'm sorry to say this, anally violated. There was bleeding and tearing and no evidence of lubrication. There was also the presence of male semen only in this area, and that was collected. Crystal had been on her period, so they suspected that her murderer was disgusted by this fact and decided to take away Crystal's control, her power, and her vulnerability so completely that they did something so violating and painful just to get their way. It's possible that this had been happening while Sarah was asleep, and that Crystal tried to stay quiet so that her daughter didn't have to know what was happening. Sarah didn't know this information for years. The news of Crystal's sexual violation was confidential evidence, but it confirmed to the police that they were looking for a male perpetrator. It was so humiliating and painful for her entire family to know what Crystal was put through. They couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. I'm sharing these details with you because you need to understand how much of a monster Crystal's killer really was. This is complete overkill, and the question was, who would do this? Investigators looked for any clue that might reveal why someone would attack Crystal. They thought that, because there was no forced entry, Crystal might have let her killer inside. But it would have been odd if they were a stranger, especially given the time of night, and while Crystal was so completely vulnerable, just wearing a bathrobe and getting ready for bed. She either knew him, or she felt sympathy for him. It was raining outside, so they wondered if she let a stranger inside who was asking for help, or to use her phone. But would she? They thought, a bright and street-smart mom, she wouldn't let a stranger inside the house with her daughter there. So maybe she knew this guy. A detective named Dick Pickett was assigned as the leader of this case, and he immediately started crafting a list of possible suspects in his head. Remember, this is a small town. It was easy to get people to talk and to find out what they knew about Crystal's life. The first step was to talk to the only witness, her young daughter, Sarah Perry, who was currently sitting in the hospital, receiving the news from Officer Kate Leonard that her mother was dead. When Sarah got the news, she finally let herself cry. She was trying to be so strong, but there was no chance that she could have saved her mother. There was nothing she could have done. Crystal had died before Sarah even came out of that bedroom. Detective Pickett and police officer Pat Lean interviewed Sarah to get as many details about this case as possible. They asked her, "Why did you have to run house to house? Why couldn't you just use the phone?" Sarah said that the phones weren't working, but when investigators got to the scene, they were able to place outgoing calls. Both of the phones worked fine. So they wondered if Sarah had been lying. The police figured that Sarah was just a kid who had made a genuine mistake. If the first phone had not been on its hook, it might have dialed and rang out already, requiring the receiver to be put back on the hook before it could be used again. And maybe, in a panic, Sarah hadn't thought to pick it up, hang it up, and then pick it back up. Then, on the phone in Crystal's bedroom, maybe Sarah dialed the wrong number. Maybe she put in 991, or maybe the landlines randomly cut out because of the storm and Sarah's frantic rush to call the police. It made sense that she probably couldn't get the phones to work. It's just a scary reality that she had to run in the dark, all alone, to find help. The police asked Sarah to describe that day in detail. What did Crystal do the night before she died? Did she have any plans to see anyone? Had she been threatened? Sarah said she could not remember most of the day, no matter how hard she tried to pry open her brain. It was an average day. She didn't know what her mom had been up to. However, she did mention Teresa, the woman who had been threatening Crystal for years. But by this time, police had seen evidence of Crystal's violation and found it unlikely it would be Teresa or any woman who could have done this. Then, Detective Pickett asked for more details about the murder itself. He asked Sarah if she knew her mother's killer. Sarah said she didn't know. They asked her if the killer was Crystal's current fiancé, Dennis, and again Sarah said she didn't know. She thought maybe it could be, but she didn't think he was that dangerous. Then they wanted to know, how did Sarah know that Crystal had been stabbed with a knife if she was in her bedroom and couldn't see the attack? Sarah responded that it was obvious. It was a knife. She was like, "What, did my mom get stabbed with a spoon?" She was definitely putting on the 12-year-old sass, but it made Pickett suspect that she was withholding information. So he put more pressure on her, even though she had just been told her mom was murdered. He kept asking questions about it. He especially wanted to know all about Dennis because, as you know, it's usually the husbands, the exes, the boyfriends, and the fiancés who end up being murderers, and there's always a motive. In small-town Maine, it was common for men to commit violent acts against women they were with. But Sarah insisted she didn't know who killed her mom. She wouldn't cover up this crime, not for Dennis, not for anyone. She liked Dennis, but she loved her mom more than anything. If she knew who did this, surely she would tell them. But police didn't know what to believe. Sarah had been there the whole time, but she hadn't seen anything. They wondered, could she have blacked out or just not remembered this traumatic event? They thought there had to be something missing. Detective Pickett told Sarah that they would take another statement later, and then he continued with his other interviews. In the next 3 days, the police interviewed Sarah 19 times. She's only 12, that's insane. The same questions over and over again, expecting a new response. They wanted to know if Sarah knew who killed Crystal. Was it Dennis? Was it Dale? Was it Tom? Was it Tim? Sarah said again and again, I don't know. And when the autopsy results came back confirming there was male DNA at the crime scene, Teresa was completely ruled out. But whoever had killed Crystal, whether it was her fiancé, her exes, or a stranger, Detective Pickett was determined to find out who he was. The investigators ended up finding a shoe that was sold at a local store that matched the bloody footprints. It was an Oak Harbor brand leather lace-up shoe, so at least they knew what they could compare it to if they found a suspect. At 4 a.m. Thursday morning, just a couple of hours after Crystal's body had been found, 4 police officers showed up at Dennis's doorstep along with his parents. The moment Dennis opened the door, they asked him if he had gone anywhere or seen Crystal the night before. His words were, "Is she all right?" They asked again, "Have you seen Crystal?" And that's when Dennis panicked. He asked if she was dead, and then he actually passed out. He had to recover in a police car, and then they started the questioning again. Dennis told the police he had gotten home from work a little past 8 o'clock, as usual. After helping fix one of his buddy's trucks, he called Crystal at 8:07 p.m. Remember, they usually hung out on Wednesdays and Saturdays every week. But since he was late, she was already upset the moment she picked up the phone. Dennis said he tried to make amends and promised to come over right now, but Crystal said, "Don't bother." Then they started to argue, and eventually, Crystal said she was exhausted and promised she would just see him on Saturday. Police were able to confirm Dennis had worked at his friend's house on a vehicle, but no one could prove that he wasn't at Crystal's that night. The police asked him to take a polygraph test. They asked him a bunch of questions, including, "Did you kill Crystal Perry?" Dennis said no, and he was telling the truth. But when they asked him if he felt responsible for her death, and he said no, the machine went crazy. Dennis was lying. He did feel responsible for her death, but why? Was it survivor's guilt? Was he just feeling bad he wasn't there that night to protect her, or was it something more? He ended up failing 2 polygraphs. He also wore the same size shoe as the footprints they found at the scene, but they didn't find any matching shoes in his possession. They didn't have any concrete evidence to hold him, but he did agree to give them a DNA sample. But when he did, he asked for a favor in return. He said to them something to the effect of, "I know it's looking like everything's pointing in my direction, and if it comes to the point where I need to be arrested, please come to the back door of my workplace." He said that his bosses were always good to him, and he didn't want to create a scene and disrupt the business. That does kind of make it seem like he's guilty, doesn't it? But maybe he just figured, you know what? I'm the prime suspect, so it's inevitable. I'm the fiancé gonna get arrested. Detective Pickett interviewed Crystal's best friend, Linda. They had known each other, like I said, since they were about 8 years old, and they also interviewed her current boyfriend. Linda said the last time she talked to Crystal was several weeks before that. Crystal had called her, just sobbing over the phone, telling Linda she was scared. She said that she and Dennis had gotten into another screaming match, and that he grabbed her by the arm and punched the door, denting in the steel. Now she had to get it replaced. Crystal told Linda she was afraid of ending the relationship with Dennis, but she was trying to put her foot down. The arguments were getting so bad, according to Crystal, that she was scared of seriously getting hurt. Linda told police that Dennis was not the right man for Crystal, and that's quite an understatement. Nobody deserves to be around that kind of behavior. Crystal had called the next week on Friday, but Linda missed that call. She told police she wondered if something had happened again, but now it was too late to know, and she felt so guilty. The police went over to Crystal's co-worker Penny's house, the one who stood across from her at the shoe shop. The 4 officers informed her of what happened and asked her if she knew anyone that would want to hurt Crystal. Of course, Penny was absolutely devastated by the news. She gave them a few suggestions of men around town who had either harassed Crystal or made her feel uncomfortable. When the police left, Penny got an almost immediate knock on her door, and guess who it was? Dennis. They were friends, so she did let him in, and she gave him a hug. But Penny thought that it was very strange that he would show up so soon. It was like he was waiting for that exact moment after they left. What was he trying to prove? She just found it to be a little odd. Over the next 2 days, police interviewed people all over Bridgton, hoping the rumor mill would lead them to justice for Crystal's family. Someone reported that a man named Donnie Martin got drunk at a party and went around telling people that he killed Crystal Perry. When police brought him in for questioning, he conveniently forgot everything he said that night. On Saturday, a woman named Miranda White contacted the police with a tip. She said she was in the area where Crystal lived the night she was murdered, and that her dad had finally convinced her to call the police with this tip. Miranda said she got off work at Subway restaurant around 1 a.m. She was driving home when she heard the sound of an ambulance, and it made her scared because her boyfriend was a huge troublemaker. He was always getting into something or getting hurt, and the ambulance was headed in the direction of his house. So she had a bad feeling. She was scared for him. She followed that ambulance, which to her relief passed her boyfriend's house on Route 302 and continued to go to Route 93. So she turned around before she even got to Crystal's house. Then she headed back past her boyfriend's house and into town. But here's the tip she wanted to give them. She said that the moment she turned on Route 93, a car came barreling up behind her with their brights just flashing in her eyes. She thought that was really weird. It was just very out of the ordinary, especially since they were in such a rush. She turned onto Route 302 and then onto High Street. She was worried that that car was going to tail her, but it turned off into a side road. Miranda passed her boyfriend's house again and drove the rest of the way home. She arrived just in time to hear a police scanner that they received a 911 call from the Italian restaurant. Miranda recounted the story to the police at the station. It kind of seemed like a promising lead. They wanted to know what the vehicle looked like that was speeding behind her. Could this be Crystal's murderer escaping the scene? Police had more questions and they asked Miranda if she would do a polygraph, but she didn't really feel comfortable with that. Since she wasn't a suspect, she was free to go. However, the police got one good thing from Miranda's testimony about Donnie Martin. Remember him? The partygoer telling everyone he killed Crystal? She said he was harmless. He was completely wasted that night and just trying to get attention, which really doesn't excuse the fact that he's going around telling people he murdered someone. I don't know what's wrong with people. I've heard people do this in other cases, and I have no idea why. Crystal's funeral was held 4 days after her murder. The sky was vividly blue, and after a short visitation, Crystal was cremated. She loved peach-colored roses more than anything, and Sarah picked out peach-colored flowers for the ceremony. But the funeral was tinged with the knowledge that anyone in this small community could be her killer. Wen's brother believed that Crystal knew who killed her. She must know them in some way, and police thought so too. The crime just felt too personal to be random. In the next few weeks, the family put up posters on telephone poles, encouraging people to come forward with tips, and when it rained, they replaced those posters again and again. It was only one of 2 unsolved murders in Bridgton's history as a town, and people all over the area were desperate to know what happened to this beautiful, intelligent young woman. Detective Pickett and his team monitored all the locations that Crystal usually visited for suspicious activity, including the shoe shop and Gracie's house, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 8 days after the murder, Crystal's best friend Linda called him with a tip. She said that she had seen a newer model Ford pickup truck parked up the street from her. Linda lived close to Crystal and Sarah, so she often went on walks in that area, and Linda had never noticed this truck before. It even had New Hampshire plates. However, Detective Pickett thought this was pretty normal, since there were plenty of people who could have parked it there, and it wasn't exactly outside Crystal's house. But he wrote it down anyway, just in case, and put it in Crystal's file. Tips continued to come in, but the biggest lead was the DNA found at the crime scene. It took between 6 months and a year for these DNA samples to be processed. Now, during this time, Detective Pickett had ruled out Crystal's ex-husband, Sarah's father, Tom, saying that he didn't think he was responsible, even though he did have a motive. He and Crystal were not on good terms. He was living with Teresa, who was also his alibi, and we know she's not a good person. She actually spent days ripping down the posters that Crystal's family had hung up, so they wondered if Teresa had convinced him to get revenge. But Tom, he didn't seem capable of this crime. First of all, he drank away too much every night to even have the coordination necessary to commit such a violent act. I guess alcohol was a saving grace because he was ruled out for now. But there was another man that used to be in Crystal's life, her ex, Dale. He was using a lot of substances in 1994 as well, and after Crystal passed away, he got in a horrible car accident that paralyzed the passenger of the car. Dale ended up going to prison for driving under the influence, and even though he was violent, his personality didn't seem to be consistent with this murder. And if he had done it, at least he was already in prison. But finally, the DNA results came back 9 months after Crystal's murder. Out of the police's 7 suspects, Tom and Dale were exonerated. The DNA just did not match. Crystal's ex, Tim, and other men that she met through friends were also not responsible, and Dennis was not a match. He wasn't the murderer either. This was actually pretty surprising to detectives, and Detective Pickett was like, now what? Were the DNA results just wrong? Was he missing something? At this time, DNA processing wasn't like it is today, so it makes sense that they just didn't trust it. However, it was being used as incriminating evidence in really public cases like the O.J. Simpson trial, the reason I got started in true crime. So they needed to find this DNA match, and they got another DNA sample from Dennis. They wanted to test it again because they were back at square one. They wanted to really make sure they could rule Dennis out. Detective Pickett was still convinced Sarah wasn't telling the truth either, as the sole witness. There had to be something she was leaving out, something that she had blocked out in her memory. Sarah had actually gone to live with her Aunt Tootsie in Texas, and it was already a very hard transition. She was terrified to be alone, and of course, she had trouble adjusting. But detectives went out there anyway. Detective Pickett, along with Police Chief Bob Bell and an officer named Dale Keegan, bought plane tickets for San Angelo, Texas. Officer Keegan had been newly trained in FBI interviewing techniques, and he hoped that, with the polygraph test and some time to think about Crystal's murder, Sarah might be willing to give them some answers. I don't know why they would assume this poor girl is lying about her own mother's murder, but on the first day, Sarah agreed to be hooked up to a lie detector. Officer Keegan asked her all kinds of questions, things like, "Do you know for sure that the person who killed your mother was?" And then he would fill in the blank with different names of all the male suspects. Sarah said no every single time, and every single time she was honest. But the officer still believed she had some sort of repressed memories. They just had to uncover them from the depths of her brain. Even Sarah's own Aunt Tootsie believed she could be hiding something. But Sarah insisted the only gaps in her memory were from the day leading up to the crime, not the crime itself. She vividly remembered that. After 3 days of interviews, Sarah even started to doubt her own memory. "That's what happens," she told Officer Keegan. She'd seen a blue car, and then she said, "You know what? It could have been Dennis," but she hadn't seen him. Sarah had seen and heard Dennis in her house so many times and only mentioned the blue car once. so the police felt they had no new concrete information. On the last day, they got fingerprints from Sarah's hands. All of the finger and handprints on those glass doors in the home belonged to Sarah, so even the fingerprints had led to a dead end. When Sarah asked about the investigation, she was told that the DNA samples were still being processed. But the police lied. We know the DNA samples had already come back 2 weeks ago, but they were double-checking to see if Dennis was innocent before they revealed to Sarah and the public what they knew. They don't like leaving anything undone in their line of work, and I think we know that all too well. And it's not always for good reasons. Who knows how long Dennis's DNA results were going to take? It seems like it takes forever. Of course, it was still an open investigation, so the police could not reveal any details to the newspapers. People still speculated about what happened. One newspaper reported that a local man from the area, Lloyd Millett, who had been charged with murdering 2 other women, might be Crystal's killer. When they interviewed this man, he said he never visited Bridgton before, and he hadn't killed her. This ended up being true. There was nothing linking him to the crime. But news of Crystal's murder spread from county to county, and people tried to keep her memory alive. By May of 1996, the family was exhausted with the length of this investigation. Crystal's sister, Carol, said, "We're tired of waiting." And Crystal's mother told the Portland Press-Herald that at the beginning of the investigation, she would call the police sometimes every other day, and they used to call her once in a while, but they don't even do that anymore. The family actually put out a $10,000 reward for any tips that could lead to Crystal's killer. They really hoped that people wouldn't forget Crystal, and Gracie was obsessed with figuring out who had taken her daughter from her. It was all she would talk about. The family deserved justice, and the Bridgton PD knew it. For the 2-year anniversary of her death, Chief Bell took a team of investigators to the shoe shop that Crystal worked at, and they interviewed the workers for 6 hours. They told the Bangor Daily News that this was an ongoing and active investigation. They were just waiting on a DNA sample, and we know this was Dennis's second one. It took over 10 months to process, but when the sample came back, it was negative again. The man was innocent, and I bet this was so frustrating for Detective Pickett. He had done hundreds of hours of interviews, and he kept working on this case, but years went by, and still, he ended up with no substantial evidence. Then, in the summer of 1999, when Sarah was going into her senior year of high school, Detective Pickett got a job in the Peru, Maine area, and he left the Bridgton PD. So another head detective was assigned to the case. His name was Lieutenant Walter Gribb. Sometimes, it helps to get a fresh perspective on a case. Lieutenant Gribb got the ball rolling really fast. Sarah remembers that when Lieutenant Gribb got on the case, he and his team would draw so much blood from men for DNA testing that they were known in the town as the vampires, which I think is pretty cool. These detectives knew that someone in this town was responsible, and they had been walking free for over 5 years. As part of Lieutenant Gribb's initial investigation, he contacted Sarah. He knew she had been subjected to dozens of interviews, so he promised that if she worked with him, this would be the very last time she was officially interviewed for the case. Of course, Sarah was a little hesitant at first, but eventually, she agreed to help. She went to weekly sessions with a Harvard-educated psychiatrist and hypnotherapist named Dr. Daniel Brown. For several sessions, Dr. Brown tried to reveal her repressed memories. When he asked if Sarah remembered seeing anyone attacking her mother, she still answered no. The doctor finally confirmed that Sarah had no significant repressed memories, and that was that. Sarah herself had been through a lot in the years after her mother passed away. The first few days, she stayed with Glenise and Wendell at Gracie's house, and then she moved in with her Aunt Carol and her husband in Peru, Maine. Their home was an hour's drive from Bridgton in a dark, isolated part of the woods, and Sarah had PTSD and anxiety. She couldn't stand living at Carol's house, so when Sarah's old babysitter, Peggy, called Carol and offered to take her in, Sarah was so happy to move back to Bridgton. But as much as it seemed like this was a nice gesture, there's actually a special place in hell for people like Peggy, and I'm going to tell you why. This poor girl, she's been through so much. First, Peggy told Carol that she was Crystal's very best friend in the world, which was a lie. She wasn't, and Carol didn't know any better. Peggy was taking advantage of all the money the state was sending her for Sarah. Whatever money didn't go to Sarah's needs, Peggy would keep for herself instead of putting it into savings for Sarah. Peggy also had it in her head that in order to help Sarah, she needed to keep talking to her about what happened that night. Eventually, Peggy got so frustrated that Sarah wasn't responding to her therapy that she decided to send her back to Carol's house, which was actually a good thing. But after this, Sarah went on a vacation to her Aunt Tootsie's house in San Angelo, Texas. Tootsie was actually in the army and had a husband and 2 young boys. Sarah stayed there for 3 weeks. That's when those detectives had flown out there, remember? Tootsie said she finally had to talk with Carol about how Sarah felt living there permanently with her. Sarah liked Texas. It was new. She was anonymous, and she'd made friends with the next neighbor, so she said yes. But while Sarah excelled at school, staying with Tootsie, who was actually controlling and unpredictable, was pretty rough. They had a complicated relationship. Tootsie was strict about little things, including the length of time Sarah could take a shower and who she could hang out with. But Tootsie loved Sarah in her own way. Remember, Tootsie grew up in the same conditions that Crystal had. They were sisters, and she was trying her best. She once made an entire scrapbook for Sarah for Christmas, full of pictures of her mother, and she addressed it, "From Mom." Tootsie also convinced her husband that they should adopt Sarah, but then she got divorced. One day, she told Sarah, "Your Aunt Carol and I talked last night, and we agreed it would be best if you went back to Maine." She gave Sarah 2 options: leave next week or leave at the end of her semester. Sarah wanted to stay until the end of the semester because she had things like band practice and she wanted to say goodbye to all of her friends. But then, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, Tootsie changed her mind and said Sarah would be leaving in 3 days. She claimed that the adoption was just so that they could get health care. So Sarah did go back and live at Carol's house and finished high school in Peru, Maine. Sarah always loved writing and applied to Davidson College in North Carolina as an English major. She maintained a good relationship with Carol, Gwen, and Glenise. Sarah graduated in 2004 and became an administrative assistant at the University of North Carolina, where she started to work on her memoir. Sarah even got a master's degree in nonfiction writing from Columbia University and held teaching jobs in New York. Now Sarah is an assistant professor of nonfiction writing at the University of North Texas. Her first book, which I mentioned earlier, called After the Eclipse, was nominated as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Pick, and a Poets and Writers Notable Nonfiction Debut. Sarah has had a really successful career, and she attributes a lot of that success to her mother. Crystal had dreamed of giving Sarah the opportunity to be whoever she wanted, and Sarah went for it. In 2006, when Sarah was 24 and still working at the University of North Carolina, she got a phone call from Lieutenant Gribb. He had actually been promoted and was no longer working as the head detective on her mother's case, but he was still working closely with the detectives, one in particular, the lead detective, Chris Harmon. He and Detective Harmon had put in hundreds of hours of work interviewing and investigating the case, preparing the evidence for a trial, just in case they were able to find a DNA match. Finally, after 12 years, they called to say they had solved it. There had been many rumors over the years that a serial killer had done it, or a local handyman who was mad at Crystal for rejecting him, but they were ruled out. Here's how they finally figured out who Crystal's killer was. Back in 2003, 9 years after Crystal's murder, a man named Michael Hutchinson had gone to jail for criminally threatening someone using a gun. Now Michael and his friends were going after a 19-year-old guy named Ian who had stolen some of their marijuana plants. They chased Ian all across town in a car, and Michael's friend held Ian at gunpoint using Michael's gun. Michael ended up receiving 6 months in prison and 3 years of probation. Now the state of Maine requires that any person who's convicted of a crime go through a routine process of being entered into a database. One of the requirements is to provide a DNA sample. So they used one of those long Q-tips, you've probably seen them before, and they swabbed the inside of his cheek. They plugged his sample into the Maine State Police Crime Lab's database, and Michael just moved on with his life. Well, 3 years later in 2006, now 12 years after Crystal's murder, Michael Hutchinson was still on probation when he was charged with driving under the influence with his children in the car. He violated his probation and didn't show up to court, so on the day of Michael's would-be wedding, while he was supposed to be getting married to Dennis's cousin, Christy, remember Dennis, Crystal's ex-fiancé? Michael was marrying his cousin. It's a small town. The police intercepted the wedding between the ceremony and the reception. They put Michael in prison again, and he was going to be there for several years because they didn't trust him not to violate probation again. 21 days later, after they ran his DNA again in the system, it came up as a match to the blood and semen found at Crystal's house the night she was murdered. It was him. He was the monster. Detective Gribb asked Sarah if she had ever heard the name Michael Hutchinson. She hadn't, but there was no doubt about it. Michael's DNA was all over the crime scene. Unfortunately, it took this long because there had been a huge backlog at the Maine State Crime Lab. It had taken 3 years to even analyze Michael's DNA sample. And this is actually so common here in the US. Apparently, Maine's backlog is a lot smaller than most states, because it can take up to 10 years. Luckily, in 2007, the Maine Department of Public Safety was given $200,000 in grants to help speed up the forensic examination of these DNA samples so that cold cases could be solved quicker. Lieutenant Gribb explained that Michael was behind bars for another crime and would continue to be until his trial. They hadn't even confronted him about Crystal's murder yet. At the very least, Sarah was relieved to know that Crystal's murderer was locked away. But at the time, Lieutenant Gribb asked her if she could please keep things as quiet as possible. He still had to interview Michael. However, he did let Sarah know that she could tell her family. But Sarah knew how fast rumors spread. She knew that if any of her aunts found out, the news would get to Gracie, and Gracie would tell the whole county. Sadly, before Sarah could tell her grandmother who Crystal's killer was, Gracie passed away. She had dementia, and not many people knew how quickly her health was actually declining. Gracie never got to learn who the killer of her daughter was, which is just tragic. Lieutenant Gribb looked into Michael Hutchinson so he could prepare to make his case. Michael grew up in Bridgton in a house where his father, Brad, beat his mother constantly. He was in the same graduating class as Dennis and had really poor grades in school. After his parents divorced, he ended up working for his father as a stonemason. At the age of 19, Michael lived with Brad on High Street, which is right near the junction between Route 93 and Route 302. Here's how close that is to Crystal's house, under 2 miles. Michael's mom lived a little further off Route 93, but every single time Michael drove from his dad's house to his mom's house, he turned onto Route 93 and passed Crystal's. He would have passed Crystal's house at least once a week, and Brad lived close enough to Crystal and Sarah that when they went on walks, they walked right past his house. There would be no doubt Michael had seen Crystal before, at least out and about in public, and he somehow targeted her for some reason. Michael regularly abused substances and sold drugs. He also beat his first wife in front of his children, and she had a restraining order against him. Both of these resulted in a long criminal history of DUI, domestic charges, along with arrests between 2003 and 2006. This man was a criminal through and through. Now, Lieutenant Gribb needed to confirm that he was also a liar. He visited Michael at the Cumberland County Jail and asked him if he knew Crystal Perry. He told him twice that he didn't. So Lieutenant Gribb was supposed to believe that Michael's DNA was at the crime scene, but he didn't even know Crystal? Nice try. Then Lieutenant Gribb noticed a huge scar across the palm of one of Michael's hands. The police knew that Michael's blood was at the scene of the crime. Crystal thought back, so the perpetrator was bound to have a scar from where he was slashed by the knife. When Gribb asked Michael where he got that scar, he said it was from a car wreck he was in, but Gribb knew he was lying. He'd already lied about knowing Crystal. He would lie again and again, and this was going nowhere. The police obtained a search warrant. They took a second sample of his DNA, as well as a foot impression, so they could confirm that Michael's shoe size matched the shoe prints that were found in Crystal's home. Then, they did even more testing on the carpet fibers and the blood found on the kitchen sink and floor, and everything came back positive to Michael's DNA. There was no doubt about it, he was Crystal's killer. He was indicted on Thursday, April 6, 2006, and charged with murder. The next week, finally, Crystal's family was able to get the answers they deserved. There is some really interesting evidence that Sarah, Lieutenant Gribb, and Detective Herman were able to find after the trial. I was shocked to see how much Detective Pickett let his own biases get the best of him. There were some avenues he could have definitely explored and didn't. This case did not need to take 12 years. If Michael had been identified as a suspect right away, it was exactly a year until the trial. During that year, Michael's lawyer motioned to suppress the DNA evidence at trial. How, when that was the main reason this man was going to be convicted? He argued that collecting Michael's DNA was an unreasonable search and seizure. But Michael had already been arrested. When you're in prison, you're not guaranteed all the same rights as someone outside of jail, and solving crimes is a lot more important than a criminal's personal privacy. Plus, they swabbed his cheek. They didn't take blood from him, so it was ruled that Michael's DNA evidence would be revealed to the jury no matter what. The trial was held in April of 2007 when Michael was 31 years old. When Sarah walked into that courtroom and stared him in the eyes, she said that he had the look of a man who had something to say. This man also got hepatitis in prison, so his skin was yellow with jaundice. Honestly, it serves him right. At the trial, Sarah saw people she hadn't seen in years, including Dennis. After Crystal's death, Dennis had trained in special combat in the military and gotten a job working on White House security systems, all with the goal of getting revenge on Crystal's killer. From everything I know about him, he's no hero, but he cared about Crystal, and he really wanted her murder to be solved, even though he had been a prime suspect at one time. Sarah was the first to testify. She said Crystal's death caused her survivor's guilt and PTSD to the point where she struggled to get close to people. Coming from such a large family, Sarah valued getting married and having children of her own one day, and Crystal wanted nothing more than to have her own children and grandchildren. But Crystal was never given the ability to have that little boy she dreamed of or the family she always wanted. Crystal would never be a grandma because Michael Hutchinson ripped all of that away from her. The prosecution actually showed that videotaped walkthrough of Crystal's house. They took it when the sun came up at 7:15 am on May 12th, just hours after the murder. They showed everything from Crystal's body to the neat row of perfume bottles in her bedroom. Even after the attack, the greeting cards she kept were all standing upright on the kitchen table, which was just a bit eerie. Then they discussed the handprints on the glass door that belonged to Sarah, and the boot prints of the perpetrator, and the lack of fingerprints anywhere else. Investigators testified that Crystal was one of the cleanest people they ever had the chance to investigate. They called her cleanliness very frustrating actually, because any marks that were left on surfaces almost immediately dissolved in the cleaning solution that was left behind by how much she cleaned, so they were unable to recover fingerprint evidence from the murderer. I've never thought about how someone's cleaning habits could affect the way investigators search a crime scene. It's good to know, but also Michael was amazing. And when it comes to jobs that naturally wear away fingerprints, the top careers are dishwashers and masons. Who knew? I didn't. So it was possible that Michael didn't even have enough of a strong ridge in his fingers to create solid fingerprints to begin with. Finally, the prosecution brought in Crystal's blue bathrobe that she was wearing the night she was murdered, and the amount of blood on it was horrifying. It was quite a sight for the jury to see. On Monday, April 2nd, Michael had testified on his own behalf. Why is it that these types usually insist on doing so? He said that he and Crystal had met at a local bar, and the night of her murder, he came by, invited by Crystal, and they had consensual sex vaginally and anally. Then, all of a sudden, after they were done, a guy wearing a black motorcycle jacket burst into her house, knocked Michael out, and then killed Crystal. Michael had to fight for his life to escape, getting a deep cut on his hand in the process. So how did you plan to prove all this, you may ask? I mean, that was quite a story. And why would he wait so long to admit that? Why didn't he just say it from day one? Well, Michael told his attorney, Robert Andrews, he was ashamed. When Robert asked him why he was so ashamed and didn't come forward, Michael pointed directly at Sarah and said, "I knew Sarah was there, so I did nothing." That statement actually gave me the chills, because what does he mean he did nothing? I mean, he didn't kill Sarah, so was that the nothing he was referring to? Or did he regret killing Crystal with a kid in the house? Or did he regret not killing Sarah when he had the chance? During cross-examination, prosecutor Lisa Marquez absolutely wrecked Michael's version of events. She destroyed it. There was only one set of footprints on the floor, and they were his. Crystal was barefoot, and only one set of boots made all those frantic prints in the kitchen. There was no proof that a second person had been on that floor, so he couldn't have been knocked out. Lisa gave him one of those finger pointers and asked him to stand in front of the jury and map out the path that he'd taken throughout the house while he was fighting this intruder. And guess where he pointed? To where all of those greeting cards were still standing straight up. He had no clue, and there were no boot prints near that spot either. He also pointed to the area in the kitchen where Michael said the intruder opened the drawer to get that knife. But there were no drawers on that side of the kitchen. He was just making things up, and it was so clear. Michael Hutchinson was found guilty on Monday, April 9, 2007, for murder, extreme cruelty, and forcible sexual penetration. He received life in prison without parole. Maine doesn't have a death penalty. Murder is punishable by anywhere between 25 years to life in prison without parole. So in fact, Michael was the first person in Maine in almost 3 years to get a life sentence. It's one of the more forgiving states. He tried to appeal the sentence again because of his DNA sample, but again he failed. Sarah found Detective Pickett's report with a note from the tip that she called in. When Sarah started researching for her book, she went through all the documents, the videotaped interviews, and the notes made by detectives, and she found out that Michael had been lurking in the shadows all along. For example, she found that car wreck report from June of 1994, the one where Michael said he got that scar on his hand. In the report, it said he owned a blue Ford pickup truck with New Hampshire license plates. Recall hearing about a vehicle like that with a New Hampshire plate? Well, if you remembered Crystal's best friend Linda's tip, you would be right. Sarah found Detective Pickett's report with a note from the tip that she called in. She said she was curious about a black Ford pickup truck with a New Hampshire license plate parked on Crystal's street. It was the same car. It was actually Michael's dad, Brad's car, and Michael used it all the time right in the area where Crystal usually went on her walks. Why hadn't Detective Pickett looked into this? Because he didn't think it was important. Then, Sarah found Detective Pickett's report of his interviews with that girl, Miranda. Remember, she was the one whose dad told her she's got to call in the tip about the car that was kind of chasing her down the road where Crystal lived on the night of her murder. She was the witness who had driven by Crystal Perry's house on her way home from work. During her initial interview, I told you they asked her to take a lie detector test, but she said she didn't really feel comfortable. Well, actually, according to the notes in the file, Miranda ripped off the lie detector equipment. Didn't they find that a little suspicious? I guess I've never taken a polygraph test. I don't know. Maybe it makes some people very nervous, but the detectives didn't follow up with Miranda until the next year. And that was after the DNA results came in. Detective Pickett questioned her, and Miranda again said she'd been following the ambulance because she was concerned that her boyfriend was in trouble. Detective Pickett wrote down a note for himself that said, "She's dating Michael Hutchinson, who lived up on Route 32 at the time." Wow. He literally wrote the killer's name. So Detective Pickett knew Michael lived in that area where Crystal was, and Miranda had been concerned about him that night, but they never once questioned the man. If they had, maybe they would have seen that big injury on his hand, or at least the scar if it had healed by the time they actually brought him in. So, Michael was under their noses for 12 years, but because Detective Pickett looked at the case like a textbook overkill case, and he knew it was common for the perpetrator to be an ex-boyfriend or a fiancé. He was biased, and he let that get in the way. I doubt that he had bad intentions, but he could have followed so many different leads for such a close-knit community. I'm surprised that Michael's DNA never got tested. Also, when Sarah was collecting information for her memoir, she had a conversation with her Aunt Gwen. Gwen and her husband were convinced that they had met Michael before. She remembered coming over to Crystal's house with her husband for a surprise visit. Crystal didn't know they were coming, and little Sarah opened the door. When they asked her, "Where's your mom?" she said Crystal was in her bedroom. When Gwen knocked on Crystal's door, she came out with a young man, and it looked like they had just been intimate. This was around the same time Crystal had just started seeing Dennis, and Gwen remembered the guy looked about Dennis's age, young, like 19 or so. He introduced himself with a one-syllable name, but Gwen and her husband could not remember what the name was. Now they think it could have been Michael. Either way, Michael Hutchinson committed the crime. Had they met at a party? Did they pass each other on their street? Did he target her? Did he come to her door that night and make up some story about his car breaking down and needing to get out of the rain? He could have even said he was a friend of her fiancé. We won't know. But all of this was because he wanted to take something from Crystal. He wanted her body, he wanted pleasure on his terms, and he took that and more. We'll never know the truth. That we'll never know the truth. That's one gift that killers get to hang on to, knowing exactly what they did. Sarah will never feel safe again. She doesn't think Michael is insane. He isn't a sociopath. She thinks he's a man like any other man, a product of our society. He's a man who grew up in a system of toxic masculinity and generational violence. He killed and violated Crystal because it made him feel powerful, and sometimes that's so much scarier than a one-off incident or even a random serial killer. These people slide by in society. They could be next to you on the bus or in a store. They could be someone's boyfriend, husband, or even their father. They're ordinary but evil, and Sarah wants to create awareness for the systems that create people like this, so we can dismantle those systems. It's her mission to tell Crystal's story in a way that actively helps law enforcement become better at training new investigators, and that will honor her mother's life. Sarah says, "I'm glad Michael Hutchinson is in jail, but I'll be glad when there are no more Michael Hutchinsons." Crystal deserved so many more years. She endured constant hardships and continued to still be positive, energetic, and kind. A devoted mom, sister, and friend. She was constantly laughing with her coworkers, pouring energy into her work, and finding joy in the small things. Thunderstorms, making the bed, her favorite earrings, and ice cream. She was such a passionate, loving mom, and she just danced through life. The quest for the American dream is what countless individuals aspire to attain: a home, a loving family, and a thriving career. One woman in California had finally realized this dream. She had everything she ever wanted and had put in immense effort to achieve it. However, in a matter of seconds, everything turned upside down when she found herself in an unexpected situation with only moments to survive. Now, let's get into the story for today. For generations, people from across the world have come to the United States seeking a fresh new start. Whether they're in search of fame and fortune, fleeing economic hardship, or simply wanting to make a better life for themselves and their families, moving halfway across the world is a life-changing experience. For those seeking new opportunities, they're willing to do everything they can to realize their dreams. People who have often arrived with nothing have managed to build a life and a legacy for which their families are forever grateful. But sometimes, the happy and fulfilling life that someone has created in their adopted country is ripped away so brutally that it's difficult to comprehend how this could happen. Today's case does take place in California, but in order to understand everything, I've got to take you out of the United States altogether and introduce you to a woman named Ildiko Krajniak. She was born on June 8, 1969, in the city of Miskolc, which is in the northeastern part of Hungary in Central Europe. Miskolc is the country's fourth largest city, and it is 115 miles from the capital of Budapest. Ildiko grew up with her parents, Laszlo and Juliana, and her brother, also named Laszlo after their father. Unfortunately, There isn't much that we could find out about Ildiko's childhood, but from what I could gather, she was extremely close with her family. Life in Central and nearby Eastern Europe was not easy, especially during the 1970s. What I found out about Ildiko's upbringing is that, following the end of World War II, Hungary was occupied by the Soviet Union, which today we know as Russia. A communist government was established at the time. The country suffered economically, resulting in an uprising in 1956 as Hungarian people attempted to take back control of their country. Their efforts were thwarted by the Soviets, who killed 2,500 Hungarians in violent confrontations. They arrested and imprisoned 26,000 more and executed at least 350 citizens. The extreme political unrest and instability were the catalyst for over 200,000 Hungarians fleeing the country. But for those left behind, especially people of Ildiko's parents' generation, life under an oppressive communist regime was very difficult. By the time Ildiko was born, economic and cultural policy reform was just starting to improve, and so was the quality of life. People began demonstrating against the government, and living standards were getting better. However, high rates of alcoholism and self-inflicted deaths still affected many people as they struggled to live in this kind of climate. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 that communism began to fall throughout much of Eastern Europe, including Hungary. The country's border with the West was finally reopened and democracy was restored. Around this time, Ildiko graduated from high school and obtained her Hungarian esthetician's license. That same year, she started working for herself. She was following in her mother's footsteps, who, it appears, previously worked in the beauty industry as well. When Ildiko had just turned 20, she was already well on her way to forging a successful career path for herself and becoming well-versed in everything involved in running her own business. She also knew the importance of ongoing industry training, and she obtained a medical aesthetic certification as well as a bachelor's degree. The fall of communism across much of Central and Eastern Europe represented a huge shift in the opportunities available to young Hungarians like Ildiko. Until now, the possibility of exploring anything outside her home country was just a dream. But now, it seemed like it could become a reality. Ildiko had valuable trade skills, and she was a very determined young woman. She knew she could work anywhere and become successful, and she knew that she wanted to explore life outside of her home country. So, in 1992, the 23-year-old took a leap of faith. She not only wanted to go beyond Hungary, but outside of Europe. With one suitcase and just $50 in her possession, Ildiko decided to fly to California, United States. It must have been incredibly exciting, but also quite a daunting experience for Ildiko, leaving her tight-knit community and family for an entirely new country and language. The first thing she needed to do was begin working. After arriving in the United States, Ildiko took care of the necessary steps to live and work in California, and she ultimately became the lead esthetician at the spa at the luxurious Newport Coast Marriott Hotel. After obtaining her California cosmetology license, she knew she only had herself to rely on. She worked very hard to establish herself as a sought-out professional through her clientele and by making social connections. Creating a new social circle was actually pretty easy for someone like Ildiko. Her friendly, charismatic personality and caring nature just seemed to pull people into her orbit. It was no doubt that these qualities also attracted her future husband, a man named Ranilo Vestal, who was only a couple of years older than Ildiko. They just adored one another. Everyone that knew the couple could see the warmth and the love between them, and they also thought they made a pretty cute-looking couple as well, and they got along so nicely together. Around 1996 is when Ildiko and Ranilo tied the knot. By this time, Ildiko had also convinced her cousin, Eva Boni, to come join her in the United States. When Eva immigrated and settled in California, the pair continued building their close, caring relationship. Ildiko called her cousin every single day to check in on her and always wanted to take Eva to explore new places and do things together. By this time, 27-year-old Ildiko had sadly lost her father just 2 years earlier. Her brother, Laszlo, and her mom, Juliana, remained behind in Hungary. Her brother had his own life and his own family, But Ildiko's mother was now all alone, and that did not sit right with her. She wanted to show her mom how great life could be with her in the United States. The pair were so close, so Ildiko helped Juliana immigrate from Hungary to the US, and she was committed to looking after her the best she could. This way, Juliana could also see Ildiko's future children grow up and enjoy the same warm and loving dynamic with her daughter and son-in-law that Ildiko remembered so well from her own childhood. It gave the mother and daughter great comfort to know that if anything were to happen to Juliana, Ildiko and Ranilo were right there and could take care of everything. Juliana did have some health issues, so it gave everyone greater peace of mind knowing Ildiko could quickly arrange to take her mom to appointments and checkups. In 1998, Ildiko and Ranilo welcomed their son, Keanu, into the world. Ildiko was instantly more in love than she could have ever imagined. She absolutely adored her son, and there was nothing she wouldn't do for him. Everything was coming together for Ildiko and her little family in her adopted country. She was determined to work even harder so she could get her son to go to a private school, which she eventually did. While Ildiko's family was her #1 priority, professionally, she was also thriving. Her natural affinity for people, her sweet, charming nature, and her light-hearted sense of humor, combined with her ambition, intelligence, passion, and strong work ethic, made her highly sought after as an esthetician. Her warm and gentle manner in treating her clients' concerns meant that she developed a loyal client base who wouldn't dream of seeing anyone else. She would even go to her clients' birthdays, baby showers, and weddings. Just like she had in Hungary in 2002, Ildiko finally opened her very own day spa called Major Cosmetica. And if you're wondering, this literally translates to Hungarian cosmetics. They provided all kinds of aesthetic services, from facials, lash extensions, massages, waxing, and so much more. On Yelp, Ildiko wrote that the spa believed in using only the highest quality products and cutting-edge technologies to deliver holistically healing treatments that would leave every client feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. The spa had a 5-star rating on Yelp, with so many amazing reviews about Ildiko herself. One review I saw said, "From the moment you meet Ildiko, you know that you're in the presence of a woman who has finally honed her skill over the years. Her private practice is a luxurious experience. I look forward to weekly for my facial treatments and my eyelash extensions." Another client said they didn't even want to leave a review because they didn't want to share Ildiko with anyone else. The spa was located in a commercial space in Southern California, in Aliso Viejo. It's about 7 miles from Laguna Beach and about 50 miles southeast of Los Angeles. It's in Orange County, and it's a quiet place to live compared to the hustle and bustle of Los Angeles. It attracts families and young professionals who are looking for a bit of a slower pace with all the benefits of the California lifestyle. It's also just 6 miles from where Ildiko and her family moved in 2005, in the Wagon Wheel neighborhood in the community of Trabuco Canyon. Ildiko, her husband, her mother, and her son lived in a 2,000-square-foot, 2-story, 4-bedroom home. It's in a very nice area. Ildiko was truly living the American dream. Of course, performing treatments and providing exceptional customer service weren't Ildiko's only responsibilities as an esthetician. To maintain her level of success, she had to stay at the top of her industry and keep up with all the developments and technology. She also had to be an effective marketer with product knowledge of multiple ranges that were second to none. Ildiko was such a go-getter that she eventually established a separate part of her day spa business, selling cosmetics. Working in an industry where appearances matter, Ildiko was also a walking advertisement for her skills and high-quality services. She was effortlessly stylish, always impeccably groomed, looking glamorous, and much younger than her age. In 2003, she updated her qualifications yet again and obtained an international medical aesthetic certification. She also taught others as an aesthetic educator, holding positions at luxury skincare companies such as Pavonia International, as well as Yonka Paris, a luxury French skincare line. She found her calling, and she had this innate ability to quickly connect with people, which made them want to be around her. And that's why she was so successful in business. She was authentic and genuinely cared about her clients, which generated repeat business. Ildiko was widely respected and well known as being a good listener who maintained her clients' confidence. She was compared to a hairstylist that you tell all your secrets to during every appointment. She was more than just someone providing a service. She was a truly remarkable woman and a great friend to everyone who knew and loved her, even to people back home. Whenever she would go back to Hungary, she would always bring souvenirs for everyone in her life, even if that meant picking out 30 different knickknacks to bring with her. She wanted everyone to know that they were loved. Another one of Ildiko's biggest passions was traveling, which she regularly did, usually back to Europe to attend industry training events and conferences to grow her skills as well as her business. But she also liked to travel for pleasure. In addition to her trips back to Europe and Hungary to see her brother, Laszlo, and his family, Ildiko thoroughly enjoyed discovering more of North America, as well as heading off to places like Mexico, Cuba, and Thailand. In mid-2016, Ildiko's son, Keanu, was off to college at Washington State University, and she could not have been prouder. Her son played the tuba in the college's marching band, which performed at the Washington Huskies football games, and Ildiko was thrilled to attend one of these games in Seattle to see her son in action. Another highlight for the family was in late 2017, when Ildiko treated her mom, Juliana, and her mother-in-law, Purita, to tickets to the filming of the TV show, The Price is Right. By 2018, things were really busy for Ildiko. By now, she had relocated her day spa after the building she originally rented from was sold. She moved to a corner suite on the bottom level of a 2-story, 11,000 square foot, red brick commercial building at 11 Mary Blue. It was still located in Aliso Viejo and a little bit closer to her home, only a 15-minute drive. The complex housed multiple businesses, including a chiropractor, a massage therapist, and mostly medical offices. Palm trees and manicured lawns lined the side of the building where the day spa was situated, and clients enjoyed a sunny view outside the tinted windows. In March of 2018, Ildiko was off to Portugal for some R&R, and then in April, her brother Laszlo arrived in the United States for a vacation and to spend some quality time with his sister and her family. They enjoyed the sights and spectacular weather, and he helped out with some business advice as well as spending time in California. Ildiko and Laszlo actually went to Seattle to visit Keanu, and then they partied in Las Vegas together. The siblings had a fantastic time and treasured the memories they made, indulging in everything from lavish meals to even getting mani-pedis together. But soon, it was time for Laszlo to return home, and Ildiko was still caring for her mom, Juliana, who, by now, sadly was suffering from dementia. Luckily, Ronio did such a great job caring for his mother-in-law. He was always there to step in and help out when Ildiko was working or getting some much-needed time away. On May 5th, Ildiko headed back to Hungary, but this time she was visiting on business. She was excited to be bringing new high-tech facial treatments back to her day spa in California, which she knew would give her clients amazing results. When she arrived back in the US about a week later, she couldn't wait to get back to work and see not only her family, but also her clients, because she really missed them. But everything changed on May 15th, 2018. Just after 1 p.m. a 911 call came in about an apparent fire, an impossible explosion, at a commercial building where Ildiko's spa was located. Emergency personnel rushed to the scene. The building was smoldering, and gray smoke was rising from inside what was left of a portion of the corner area facing the roadway of Mary Blue. When firefighters arrived, their immediate priority was evacuating not just the commercial building that was smoking, but also the surrounding buildings, including a child care center located just across the street. More than 100 scared and confused toddlers were holding hands as child care staff and firefighters guided them to the designated safe area while authorities moved in. There were even babies still inside their cribs that had to be wheeled out to safety as part of precautionary measures. No one knew exactly what happened, but many nearby heard the blasts that sent plumes of smoke, as well as debris flying through the air. Some thought it was fireworks. Others imagined maybe a pipe had burst or there'd been some kind of gas leak that went undetected until it blew up. It was easy to see that a portion of the building had been demolished. Shattered tinted glass was lying on the grass out front. You could see pink insulation hanging from what was left of the corner of the structure. And peering inside broken windows, it was evident the interior was blown apart. Tons of debris littered the inside and outside of the building. This once quiet area was full of chaos in just minutes. People fleeing the building were scared. They didn't know what was happening, or if they should expect yet another blast. Andrew Dijak, who owned a massage business inside the building, ran out and saw windows and doors completely shattered. Glass was everywhere, and a small fire was burning. Piercing car alarms from surrounding vehicles were immediately set off in a high-pitched chorus as acrid smoke filled the air and debris scattered throughout the adjacent parking lot. The force of the blast shook the neighborhood as terrified residents and workers wondered if an earthquake had just struck. People working in the surrounding buildings were coming out to see what happened. Many of them grabbed their cell phones and took videos and pictures before emergency vehicles had even arrived on the scene. Once firefighters were able to clear the area, many other units arrived. Police, a bomb squad, ambulances, all trying to understand what had happened here. The media was, of course, on the scene as well, interviewing people who had heard or seen something. One gentleman had this to say about what he experienced that afternoon. "I heard a loud boom noise, along with a jolt. Not a jolt, but a ground shaking, and it jolted me to the wall, so I kind of banged my head against the wall. A lot of people were just running around, losing their minds, saying, 'Oh my goodness, what's going on? Where's this person? Where's that person?' Parents of the children who were at the daycare across the street were frantically trying to be reunited with their kids. Here's what one mother had to say. 'It is very nerve-wracking. I think I went into tears, so I'm just glad they're safe.' I can only imagine how worried these poor parents were, hearing that some kind of bomb or explosion went off so close by. They were so lucky." Chiropractor Chris Kennedy, who also had an office inside the building, wasn't there when devastation hit, but his suite was entirely destroyed. Walls and ceilings had caved in right where the employees were sitting. Luckily, none of them were injured, and they were able to evacuate safely. But others weren't so lucky. As EMTs and medical personnel came to the building, it was apparent that there were people who had been severely injured and maybe even killed. They came upon the horrific sight of severed human limbs and debris still burning outside in the parking lot. Good Samaritans had gathered around 2 injured women, a mother and daughter who were lying on the ground, and another victim had suffered from smoke inhalation and was being treated by medics. The 2 women, whose names were never released in the media, so I'm going to refer to them as Lena and Ellie, had managed to stumble to safety through a massive hole in the brick wall, despite suffering significant burns and lacerations. They were both covered in blood and ash, with glass stuck to their bodies and singed hair. Parts of their skin were peeling off. They were rushed to a nearby hospital, where they had to undergo emergency surgery, but they were expected to survive. First responders, personnel from the fire department, and the Orange County Sheriff's Department had no idea what caused the damage or if anyone was still inside. If they were, what the extent of their injuries would be. As they carefully entered the building to investigate, there was still no sign of Ildiko. Meanwhile, it was only a matter of time before the news broke. Many people were texting friends and family to let them know what happened. A friend of Ildiko's named Holly Salcido lived only a mile or so away from the building, and she was on her lunch break when she actually heard the blast. Friends and coworkers began texting her, saying that a building on Mary Blue had exploded, and her first thought was of Ildiko. She knew her spa was on that road, and she hoped she was okay. She texted her, but she didn't get an answer. Another person who thought of Ildiko when she heard the news was Sarah Thomas. She had just been at Ildiko's spa that morning, getting her lashes done, and now she was seeing it on the news, thinking, "Oh my God, a gas explosion happened after I left." She quickly texted Ildiko to see if she was okay. Sarah couldn't believe that she had just been there, and she hoped Ildiko would get out safely if she had been in the building when the blast occurred. It just seemed so unbelievable. Hearing the news, Ildiko's husband of 22 years, Ronilo, rushed to the scene, desperate to find out if his wife had been at work, but investigators told him they couldn't tell him anything at that stage. A woman named Valerie Stone was at work when she heard the news, and she immediately thought of her boyfriend, Stephen Beale. Although he didn't physically work at Ildiko's med spa, he was one of the people who helped invest in the company and acted as one of the partners. She called him, and when he answered, he was of course shocked by what she was telling him. Stephen wasted no time after finding out. He texted Ildiko in a panic, saying, "There's been an explosion there, are you okay?" But he, too, got no answer. Another friend of Ildiko's, named Scott Mullally, drove up to find pure chaos. He was supposed to be meeting Ildiko for lunch, and now he couldn't see her anywhere. The spa was reduced to rubble. As many agencies began arriving to assess the situation, a growing number of emergency vehicles were now blocking the street. There were 2 holes in the wall where Ildiko's spa had been. As first responders entered, they soon realized that at least one person had not survived. They discovered human remains outside of a broken window, as well as in the parking lot. Remember, I had mentioned severed limbs. It is just unreal. Someone hadn't made it, and that someone wasn't identified or announced for some time since. As you can imagine, it's not a very easy task. But eventually it was confirmed that the one and only fatality had been 48-year-old Ildiko Kroniak. You can only imagine what happens to someone who is in an explosion. But nothing was given to the media at this point. Initially, some suspected maybe a car had crashed into the building. But when it became apparent it was an explosion, people started wondering if this was a tragic accident like a gas leak, or if it was something more sinister. One of those people was Officer Jack Ackerman. He knew that in March of that same year in Texas, there were bombs being sent all over, causing the same outcome, and he wondered if this could be some kind of copycat crime. Special Agent Ashley Miracle was sent to the hospital to get statements from the surviving victims, and Lead Agent Nick Vicencia was sent to the scene. There was a huge debris field that was going to have to be picked apart piece by piece to find the source of the explosion. Time was of the essence, because they knew they probably had a bomber on the loose. This didn't appear to be an accident. It was apparent that the amount of damage was extensive. After the building was cleared for secondary explosive devices, officers located the origin, or what's called the seat of the explosion, which had been near the front counter of Ildiko's med spa. The ceiling was blown open, and the floor of the building above had buckled. What law enforcement did right away was establish a command post and a dedicated tip line. One of the people to call in was Stephen, who I mentioned earlier. He's a 59-year-old who lives in Long Beach, and he told law enforcement that he was one of the co-owners and partners of Ildiko's spa. He had been alerted to the explosion by his girlfriend, Valerie, and he wanted to know if Ildiko was okay and what happened. He said he texted her at 3:15 p.m. that afternoon, but got no answer. While Orange County Sheriff's investigator Jack Ackerman and the FBI who were assisting in this case thought Ildiko's spa could have been the target, that meant anyone connected to her or the business could be at risk. Law enforcement knew there could be a possibility that a bomb may have been sent or placed at Stephen's home as well. Bomb technicians, including Deputy Stedman and FBI Task Force Officer Hickey, rushed to Stephen's Long Beach home at 7103 East El Paso Street. This is a little over 30 miles from the spa. They wanted to assess if he was at risk. Once they arrived, they told him to get out of the house. They saw there were a number of deliveries at his doorstep, and one of them could be deadly. So they placed Stephen in safety in a patrol car nearby, as bomb experts were given permission to examine the packages. Luckily, after a search of the contents of the packages, it was just things that Stephen had ordered as part of a home renovation he was working on. They still wanted to ask Stephen questions about Ildiko, because she could have been the main target. Of course, they did have to share the news of her death, and Stephen could not believe it. He also said he couldn't think of one person who would want to harm her. He described her as always smiling, someone who had great advice for people she cared about. She went out of her way to ease others' burdens. Many more of Ildiko's close friends and family would also receive the news of her death and have investigators knocking on their doors for information. Under Sheriff Don Barnes from the Orange County Sheriff's Office held a press conference the following day, on May 16th, with an update. It was still a fluid investigation, but he listened to everything that had already been done and how many different agencies were working on this case. He said, "When we arrived, we found one victim deceased at the scene, and we found 2 additional victims injured during that explosion. The injured victims are recovering at a hospital. They're currently undergoing surgery and are expected to survive. A 3rd victim, who suffered from smoke inhalation at the scene, was treated by Orange County Fire Authority and released." The first priority of the Orange County Sheriff's Department and the Orange County Fire Authority was to render the scene safe. We worked in a unified command with the Fire Authority and were able to do that in very short order. Orange County Fire Authority brought more than 70 firefighters, which included paramedics, hazardous materials specialists, urban search and rescue, arson investigators, and the Joint Hazard Assessment Team, known as JHAT, to manage the incident. The Orange County Sheriff's Department dedicated numerous resources, including our initial patrol response, our critical incident response management team, our critical incident response team, our bomb squad, tactical teams, and the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center, which worked to monitor the incident, mobile field force, and numerous investigative resources. So over 100 people from many different agencies were there assisting in search and rescue, and of course investigating what caused this to occur. The sheriff explained what they did when they got on the scene. "We immediately began to evacuate the surrounding businesses, including a preschool with more than 100 children. We also like to thank those from the adjacent businesses and the preschool for their cooperation, the ability to evacuate promptly, and their subsequent reunification efforts that took place. The Orange County Bomb Squad and Orange County Fire Authority's Hazardous Materials Team worked jointly to ensure there were no items that would cause a secondary explosion. The Hazardous Materials Team from the Orange County Fire Authority remains on the scene to assist as part of this investigation. At that time, they eliminated the possibility of another threat in that area." The deputy went on to explain what an extensive investigation this was and how fast things could change. He said, "We also called in our federal law enforcement partners from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and other federal agencies to assist in the investigation. I'd like to remind you that while we're still in the preliminary stages of the investigation, as you can imagine, this is a fluid situation. I will share with you what we believe to be true at this time, but as we've seen throughout the course of investigations like this, information changes rapidly." Working jointly, once the scene was declared safe, they began a full investigation into the cause of the explosion. The sheriff was about to give the public their theory on who was targeted and how the explosion occurred. "I want you to know what happened with the 2 surviving victims, Lena and Ellie, who they were, as well as the timeline of what they knew before the incident occurred. When the agent went to the hospital to interview the mother and daughter, she found out that they had been inside the spa when the explosion occurred. On May 15th, 2018, 48-year-old Ildiko returned to work. The spa had been closed while she was away, so, like many business owners, she had a lot to catch up on, and she had to tend to all sorts of tasks in between treating clients. That morning, her friend and client, Sarah Thomas, whom I told you about earlier, came in for an appointment to have her lashes done. They caught up on all the gossip from Ildiko's trip, and then Sarah left. Next to come in were Lena and Ellie, who were regulars and also Hungarian, like Ildiko. When the women were all finished up around 1 p.m., Lena was paying for their treatments at the front counter, while Ellie went to get something to drink. Lena noticed Ildiko pick up a cardboard box that had been sitting next to the counter, along with a pile of mail and several other boxes. Ildiko set the box on the counter and began using a tool to open it, like you would with a letter opener. Suddenly, the next thing Lena recalls was a bright light, and then the spa exploded. Windows and doors were blown out throughout the bottom level of the building, and then there was just chaos. The spa was immediately plunged into darkness as the sound of smashing glass and plumes of smoke and dust filled the air. Neither woman recalled anyone else being in the spa that morning besides Ildiko. Now, There were other practitioners that worked there, but since Ildiko had just returned from her trip, it appeared as though she was just getting back in. On that Tuesday, Lena had a very clear recollection of the appearance of the box that she recalled Ildiko opening just before the explosion. She said it was a rectangular box, like a shoebox, but not very wide. She also remembered an incredibly bright hot flash of light when Ildiko opened the package, followed by a loud boom and a massive wave of heat and pressure, which she said blew her backward onto the floor, causing flames and black smoke. Ellie actually had to dig her mother out of the rubble and pull her to safety. Sadly, one of Lena's eyes could not be saved due to a shrapnel injury. The women were grateful to be alive. Now, Ellie did not see Ildiko open the package, but she felt and heard the explosion and was knocked to the ground. Ellie described seeing everything on fire following the explosion. The mother and daughter managed to find each other in the smoke, dust, and darkness, and they exited the building, waiting for help to arrive. However, Lena did not see what happened to Ildiko. As the minutes and then hours passed, it was looking more and more like the 48-year-old mom, wife, and business owner was the target. She had been killed less than a month before her 49th birthday, but investigators held back on publicly releasing this information at this stage. However, those close to Ildiko had a feeling. Her friend Holly noticed that all of her texts were green instead of blue. That was one of the first signs that Ildiko had not made it. The explosion occurred at approximately 1:05 p.m., and here are some still frames from the chiropractic center surveillance video at 1:42 p.m. As first responders arrived inside, you could see them enter the door. There was the caved-in ceiling, blown-out walls, and debris. Now, let's listen to what else the Undersheriff Barnes told the public the following day. We believe that a business on the first floor of 11 Marablu, our female victim, was killed by an explosion that occurred within that office. The business operates as a day spa. Evidence collected and what we believe are involved in the explosion are not consistent with items that would be used at a day spa. We do not believe at this time that this was an accident. At this time, we have ruled out the potential for this to be an accident. As I said, due to the condition of the victim, we are still working to officially identify her through the Orange County Coroner's Office. Right. However, based on our investigation, we believe the victim is Ildiko Craniak, 40 years old, from Trabuco Canyon. Ildiko is believed to be the owner of the day spa. 3 search warrants were served earlier this morning. At this time, there are no arrests. In regard to this investigation, investigators are still working to confirm whether or not this was an intentional act. We are, however, investigating this as a crime, and Sheriff's Homicide is the lead investigator in this case. So there you have it. The items that they had collected and the information they gathered showed that they don't think this is an accident. The items were not from the spa, since we were told by Lena that Ildiko was opening what looked like a package, like mail. The officer also preliminarily announced that Ildiko was the single fatality. Though the explosion didn't appear to be an accident, any larger threats to the community had been ruled out. The motive wasn't clear, but terrorism had also been eliminated. As they continued to investigate, they realized that if a device had exploded, it would be challenging to recover every single component of something so destructive, and it was going to take time. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force was immediately called in to assist. Lead Agent Nick Vicencia, along with Special Agents Ashley Miracle, Chris Denning, Matt Jemenko, and FBI Task Force Officer Rob Warren, were assigned to this case. They would be assisting the Orange County Sheriff's Department, which was leading this investigation. As the undersheriff explained to the public, the hazmat team was there, along with agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the Department of Homeland Security. Meanwhile, investigators continued talking to Ildiko's family and friends, and one thing stood out right away: Ildiko's relationship with her husband. They learned that although Ildiko and Ranilo had lived together, they had been going through a separation. Friends and Ildiko's cousin, Ava, explained that the couple was in love, but as the years wore on, they grew apart. Ranilo was great, and Ildiko loved him and cared about him. He also cared deeply about Ildiko and her mother, Juliana. He took really good care of her. However, over time, they realized they were looking for different things in life. For the last couple of years at least, Ildiko had been dating other men, and Ranilo was aware of this. They did have some kind of arrangement between the two of them. It was personal, and no one knew the exact details because that was their private business. Ildiko did not like sharing information about her relationship with her husband, but on the other hand, she didn't mind sharing things about her other love interests. Holly said that she knew Ildiko had at least 5 or 6 other men over the last few years. That was important. Could one of them be involved in this explosion? Ildiko's client, Sarah, who was at the spa the morning the blast occurred, said that Ildiko had shared her excitement about a more recent guy that she had been seeing out in Sacramento. She mentioned wanting to get more serious with him. Investigators wondered if Ranilo was upset about this, especially after he had driven to the spa. Upon learning about the explosion from his brother and getting no response from Ildiko after texting her, he drove straight home, as the police instructed him to do. But unbeknownst to Ranilo, they were watching him. They soon arrived with a search warrant for the home, and this search was extensive. It went through the evening and into the next morning. Despite boxes and boxes of items seized from the home, ultimately, nothing in the residence or about Ranilo's demeanor led authorities to believe that he was some kind of vengeful husband. He was genuinely distressed that the mother of his child, who he had a deep respect and love for, had been brutally killed. Now up in Washington, Keanu had initially received a concerning message from one of Ildiko's friends, asking if Ildiko had returned from Hungary and if she was okay. They said that something bad had happened. Keanu had no idea because he didn't speak to his mom that much, now that he was away at college. But he did a quick internet search, which initially revealed that a car had crashed into the building where the spa was located. So Keanu immediately tried to contact his mom that day, but there was no response. As he was frantically refreshing the internet search, the news got worse. He found out it wasn't a car that had crashed into the building. The articles were now saying that there had been some sort of explosion. Keanu was not able to get through when he tried calling the Orange County Sheriff's Office, so he began contacting every hospital in the area, but his mom was not admitted to any of them. How sad is that for a son to be trying to find out information from the internet and not knowing what was going on? When Keanu was eventually told by the FBI that the person who had been killed was his mother, his world felt like it stopped. He couldn't breathe. He wondered, how could this have happened? He couldn't even reach his father or his grandma because the FBI had seized every device in their home. To make things worse, TV news trucks lined the street outside the family home, capturing every detail of the search of the family. They weren't allowing Ranilo and Juliana to grieve in peace. They were violating their privacy at such a traumatic time. Thankfully, Ildiko's son, Keanu, who had been in the middle of studying for his finals at college, quickly made it home to be with his grieving family just days after his mother was killed. He bravely faced the media, and here's what he had to say. There's just so many things that we don't know yet, and there's so many unknown things. It's just also sudden that a lot of this is still very raw. He did not get to say goodbye. He was out of state, and now left with this reality back home. With his father by his side, Keanu fought back tears as he told the reporters, "I just really want to express the amount of gratitude that I have for the overwhelming support that everyone has been giving my family. Obviously, this is a really hard thing for everyone to process. There's still a lot of unknown things. Personally, I would like to express my thanks for all the support people gave, especially to the GoFundMe page for all the arrangements and getting me back here from college early. There's so many things we don't know yet. It's just all so sudden. A lot of this is still very raw and still really hard to process for everybody. I want to express my gratitude for all the love and support that I've gotten from everybody. It's just been a lot." End quote. Then, Ildiko's cousin Eva stood next to a family friend, Irene White, who wrote a prepared statement on behalf of the family, saying, "This is a complete shock to family and friends. We're in full support of our public authorities to do their jobs in hopes of finding answers to many of the unanswered questions." Family always came first for Ildiko. She took great pride in finding beauty in everyone. At this time, our family and friends would like to privately mourn a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a friend. Irene concluded the statement by requesting that anyone wanting to help financially could consider donating to their GoFundMe that had been set up by Ildiko's neighbors. Not only were there now unexpected funeral expenses, but 20-year-old Keanu had to fly home as soon as possible to be with his family. On top of that, prior to her death, Ildiko had been making arrangements for her mother, Juliana, to return to Hungary, so those expenses were also up in the air. Ildiko's devastated neighbors tied ribbons in her favorite color, orange, up and down the street as a way to honor her and show support to her family. Back in Hungary, Ildiko's brother Laszlo learned the shocking news, not through a personal phone call but actually from the media. He could not believe what he was seeing and hearing. How could his beloved sister be dead? It really seemed like a bad dream, and I can't imagine, again, finding this out from the internet. The next step was for investigators to look into who Ildiko had been communicating with and her movements in the days before her death, as well as anyone who might have wanted to hurt her. Authorities searched every suite in the building on Mary Blue, Ildiko's white Lexus, which had been in the parking lot at the spa, as well as her social media accounts, her phone records, and an iPhone that was found in the spa near the blast site. As it happened, a local sheriff's deputy had routinely checked the building at 15 Mary Blue the night before the explosion, but nothing seemed out of place, and there was no suspicious activity. Unfortunately, the security cameras at 11 Mary Blue were not working at the time of the explosion. Of course, they weren't. It's like they never work when you need them to. However, there did seem to be some outside cameras in the parking lot and the surrounding area that were being combed through. Since authorities knew that Ildiko had flown back into LAX following her most recent trip, law enforcement pulled security video from the airport. They wanted to see if Ildiko had arrived back in LA with anyone else. Interestingly, they saw her on surveillance talking and laughing at the baggage claim with a man. It wasn't her husband, of course, but that was to be expected. However, it didn't appear that this man had traveled with Ildiko because he didn't have a suitcase. So they wondered, who was he? They also pulled surveillance from a layover that Ildiko had at the San Francisco airport several hours before she boarded her flight to LAX. There was another man in that footage, and it appeared that man may have made his way home from there. The man at LAX met her at the baggage claim. This guy seemed to have possibly been traveling with her, or maybe he lived in that area. All investigators had at this point were these two men, two potential faces with no names. So investigators went back to interviewing friends of Ildiko. They were also looking at anyone connected to the spa and canvassing Ildiko's neighborhood, as well as Stevens, who was her co-owner out in Long Beach. That's when they got some interesting information. One of Stevens' neighbors was asked if he'd heard or seen anything suspicious in regard to Steven, and that's when the neighbor was like, "Oh, the guy who builds rockets." What did he mean? Build rockets? Kind of rockets? Well, the neighbor said they were tall rockets that Steven used to set off in the desert. Well, what do rockets need to get set off? They need a detonator. So that piqued the investigators' interest. Steven was forthcoming. He wanted to help however he could to find out what happened. So he agreed to let officers Stedman and Hickey get a search warrant for his property, where they found several items of interest in Steven's garage. These included 7-foot-tall rockets, rocket-making equipment, 2 containers of a precursor chemical called potassium perchlorate, 2 other containers of something called red gum, which is used as fuel and binder in fireworks, and at least 3 containers of black powder. It turned out that Steven was a rocket hobbyist. He'd been making rockets for years. It was something everyone who was close to him knew about. Steven was interviewed about these rockets by Sheriff's investigator Pelayo. He gave Pelayo a brief rundown of how he knew Ildiko and how he became involved in the spa. When asked how the two of them got into business together, considering Steven was clearly not an esthetician or stylist, Steven admitted that he and Ildiko had been acquainted a few years ago in 2016. They started as friends, but they did have a period where they were together romantically. They dated for about a year, and Steven was happy to help Ildiko start the spa. Stephen signed the lease on Ildiko's new space at 11 Mary Blue because she had apparently filed for bankruptcy in 2014, so her credit wasn't so good. Stephen explained that his romance with Ildiko had fizzled out, and he started dating Valerie in April of 2018. But he and Ildiko remained very good friends and were still happily running the business together, though he wasn't actively involved. However, he explained it was pretty normal for him to stop by the day spa in his capacity as Ildiko's business manager. He would come in, see how things were going, check for mail, things like that. Stephen voluntarily went down to the Orange County Sheriff's Department to speak with investigator Ackerman. The bombing had really rattled him, and he wanted to talk to law enforcement to see if they knew whether this was an accident or not and why the business or Ildiko had been targeted. As Stephen talked further, he was a valuable source of information. Given his professional and even romantic link to Ildiko, he knew a lot about what was going on in the business and with her life. Apart from perhaps one person that he knew from Ildiko's past, who we are going to get to, he couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm her, given the nature of Stephen and Ildiko's association and the fact that he made rockets. He knew the FBI and the ATF would need to formally search his home and his vehicle in order to eliminate him as a person of interest. So that's why he agreed for that to take place. During his interview, Stephen talked about a range of things. He knew Ildiko was separated from her husband. He knew that she was seeing other men, including one out in Sacramento, and recalled that this was also mentioned by Sarah. Stephen explained that he and Ildiko had taken a trip to Portland, Portugal, just prior to their breakup, and that's when he noticed a change in her behavior. Her phone and passwords, which she had previously shared with him, had been changed with no explanation. Stephen always assumed that, while he knew Ildiko had seen other men in the past, he thought he was the only man she was currently dating. As far as he was concerned, they were exclusive, and he certainly wasn't dating anyone else. But he could tell things were not the same. When Stephen did get the confirmation from Ildiko that she wasn't interested in being exclusive, he realized they were looking for different things. After all, Stephen was 10 years older than Ildiko, and he wanted something more. For sure he understood, but of course, he wasn't thrilled that Ildiko had hidden these details about her other relationships, including this new man in Sacramento. He found this to be deceptive, and he felt betrayed. Things ended, and Stephen moved on to dating Valerie. According to him and Valerie herself, things were going well for both of them. The last time he'd been at the spa was a couple of times when Ildiko was away to pick up a check to give to the building manager, but he hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Financially, things were working well. Stephen paid the spa's $1,500 monthly rent and half of its operating costs. If Ildiko was having a hard time 1 month with the business, Stephen would lend her money, and she would always pay it back later. Stephen told investigators that he used to work as an executive consultant, but he'd been on disability for some years now due to receiving a diagnosis of something called aphasia. He said the cause was from a dose of lead poisoning. This is a disorder that causes difficulties with speech, language processing, and comprehension, even memory loss, and it can severely limit someone's ability to communicate. So he was laying low and helping where he could. At the spa, Stephen also told investigators about his hobbies, including rocket making. He was also big into acting. He had written a screenplay about a soccer mom moonlighting as an assassin. He even performed a magic trick for the officers who were interviewing him. He even said that what he was going through right now could be another creative project. The craziness of having his business partner potentially targeted by a bomber. That would make for some pretty good material. This could seem pretty heartless, but Stephen explained that there are a lot of potentially humorous anecdotes wrapped up in the most intense life situations, and audiences can relate to that. Stephen's nature was just that way. He was outgoing, he was talkative, and everybody grieves differently. But of course he also thought that some of these things could be red flags. So they moved to talking about Stephen's passion for making rockets, which was interesting given what the bomb squad had found in the search of his home. Stephen said he'd learned how to build advanced rockets from a friend, which he did until he gave up the hobby a long time ago. He said he hadn't been setting them off the way he used to for years, probably since about 2004. He wanted to clarify that, of course, rockets have explosive components. Stephen clarified that he never made bombs. The closest thing he made to something that could blow up was a small device for a neighbor to help him get rid of gophers. Stephen claimed he couldn't remember what he used for that device, apart from it having a long fuse. It was a while ago. When detectives asked Stephen if he had the skills or the know-how to create something as powerful as the device that had detonated at the spa, he was adamant that he did not. Due to the nature of that explosion, it would require a device that was way beyond his capabilities or whatever materials he might have left over at his home. Stephen told the officers he couldn't even remember what chemicals he had in his garage or when he had even used them last. It was that long ago. But he did take a guess at what sort of chemicals could be required to create an explosion like the one at the spa. Now he couldn't be sure because there were just so many possibilities. Professionals would know a lot more than he would, but he estimated any device would require what they call an oxidizer. This facilitates the fuel ignition element of the explosion. So Ackerman asked if there could have been an oxidizer in Stephen's garage, and he said he didn't know. He wasn't 100% sure. He explained that any chemicals at his home would have been ordered online between late 1992 and 2004, from the late 1990s until September 2001. He was also making fireworks, including mortars, but he said he stopped doing that after September 11th because he didn't want anyone to get the wrong impression. Well, I don't know the first thing about bombs, even fireworks, all that stuff scares me. But remember, in the search of Stephen's garage, there was a chemical called potassium perchlorate. Well, it turns out that this can be used as an oxidizer. It's actually used when you're manufacturing pyrotechnic powders, also called flash powders, both in commercial and improvised manufacturing. But they wondered, could it cause the amount of damage seen in the explosion at the spa? They weren't sure. They didn't have any reason or evidence to hold Stephen, so he left. After several hours of being interviewed, his demeanor had seemed kind of odd in the investigators' eyes. It was clear to Investigator Ackerman that Stephen was intelligent and he loved to talk, especially about himself. Even though his romance had ended with Ildiko, he seemed perfectly at ease and relatively unaffected by her sudden death. I mean, yes, he does have a new girlfriend with whom he seems very happy. He did have 3 adult children and grandchildren, and he lived on his own. He appeared to be a perfectly content adult, even if he didn't seem overly distressed that his business partner had just been killed. What they didn't know at the time was that Stephen was familiar with heartache, grief, and sudden death. He was a widower. His wife of 29 years had passed away from pancreatitis back in 2008, even though it seemed like Stephen wasn't involved in anything that happened to Ildiko. Because the investigators were conducting a more thorough search of his home and of his 2017 Toyota Prius, authorities seized a bunch of items of interest, including 2 pipe-sized, completely improvised explosive devices known as IEDs. They also found e-matches, batteries, a 9-volt battery connector, and multiple cardboard and modified rocket tubes of various sizes. These latter items were components that could all be used in the construction of IEDs. Then they found 130 pounds, yes, pounds of chemicals and propellants, 80 pounds of which were in Stephen's garage, including that potassium perchlorate and potassium chlorate, as well as 2 handguns and a shotgun. When he was asked about the IEDs, Stephen said that he did not recognize them. However, he later acknowledged that one of these was a smoke detonator, designed to release smoke during flight so that a rocket would stay visible, and that it wasn't anything nefarious. Bomb technicians had determined that the devices found in Stephen's garage could most definitely be used to create destructive devices. So on May 16th, just a day after the explosion, he was arrested by the FBI. He was charged with 1 count of possession of an unregistered destructive device. Now, this was not in connection with Deltaco's death. The investigators were merely doing their job, and it proved illegal at the time for Stephen to be in possession of these items. He was denied bail by the U.S. District Court and held in custody due to being a flight risk and possibly a danger to the community. The quantity and nature of those chemicals in his garage were questionable, at the least. On May 16th, after Stephen was arrested, Ildiko was publicly identified as the victim of the bombing. The investigation had to go on. There were still so many unanswered questions. If the device had been contained in a package, it wasn't one that was delivered by UPS, FedEx, or any similar service because it would have been detected. However, police still didn't know who could have built the device, or the nature of the chemicals or the detonator used as a bomb. Technicians gathered evidence from the scene. Anything that appeared to be part of the device was bagged up and then taken to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for further analysis. When I tell you how massive the search was, I mean just looking at the debris, you can see there are so many pieces of just all kinds of things. It's hard enough to sift through all those little pieces to determine what should be analyzed. As authorities continued their inquiries into Ildiko's life, they learned that Stephen and the man in Sacramento weren't the only ones that Ildiko dated outside of her marriage. What we do know is that law enforcement knew that her husband was not behind her death. But how much did he know about her other romantic interests and the men in her life outside their marriage? Well, Ranilo said not that much, but he did tell police that Ildiko's handyman was named Max. He did repairs and maintenance at the spa. He had a key, and for some unknown reason, he sometimes slept in his car out in the parking lot outside the business. He was looked into, but Max was quickly ruled out as having no involvement, so they had to move on. Now, Sarah had told investigators that prior to her appointment that day at the spa, she saw a man with gray hair. He was quite tall, and he was leaving Ildiko's office when she was coming in. She wondered if that could be the man from Sacramento that Ildiko kept talking about. She hadn't told Sarah that that was the guy. She didn't even introduce them. She just said they were friends. When investigators showed Sarah some of the grainy images from the airport, she couldn't recognize the man she'd seen, but police had identified him. The man at the building with the gray hair was Scott Mallory. He was the man who had a lunch date with Ildiko on the day of the bombing, and he was the same man who picked her up from LAX when she arrived home from Hungary after San Francisco. Scott said he did not know Ildiko very long. He had just met her a few weeks before that at a casino. In addition to picking her up, he also dropped her off at LAX when she flew to Europe and had driven her to the spa for her first day back at work. He didn't seem to have a motivation to harm Ildiko, but investigators checked him out and executed search warrants anyway. Law enforcement had also tracked down the man they saw in the San Francisco airport. His name was Laszlo Rabo. Not to be confused with her brother, they both have the same name. He told investigators he had traveled to Hungary with Ildiko, and they had been casually dating in the months leading up to that trip. He lived in Sacramento, and he was able to prove that he was nowhere near the spa on the day of the explosion. They were just ruling these men out one by one. A decision was finally made by Ildiko's family that her funeral would be held back in Hungary. But her many friends, an expansive social network that she had created for herself in California over the years, wanted to pay their respects and say farewell to this incredible woman they had known and loved. So, on May 25th, a memorial service was held at the San Francisco Solano Church in Rancho Santa Margarita. Meanwhile, FBI bomb technicians in Virginia continued analyzing the 300 pieces of evidence from the site of the wreckage. It was incredibly time-consuming. There were these tiny pieces spread across an 80 to 90-foot area. Then, 10 days after the explosion, near the location that they believed to be the blast seat where it began, firefighters recovered significant remnants of the bomb's components. This included the outer covering of the CV's store-branded 9-volt battery. It had been completely ripped open. The force of the explosion was so powerful that the inner cells from the battery were lodged in the ceiling. A cell phone was also found, as well as melted material that appeared to be duct tape and loose wires. Like the battery, these items were extremely damaged. As the painstaking work continued, these technicians deduced what type of device had killed Ildiko. It had been concealed inside that cardboard box, and it was something called a flash powder bomb. The mechanism to set the device off was tripped when the box was opened and was powered by that 9-volt battery. It was clear that whoever had built this device was in no way a beginner. Even though the various components were still something that someone could buy over the counter at any retail store, it was constructed by someone with sophisticated knowledge of how these things worked, including the combination of electric fusing systems and chemicals. At the same time, investigators had been analyzing terabytes worth of financial records, security footage, phone records, and data and online activity by Ildiko. They also spoke to her husband again, and he had some more information about someone who really hated Ildiko. And it wasn't a man, it was a woman. Remember, I said that Stephen had also mentioned someone that he knew didn't like Ildiko, and I said we would get to that later. Well, that's now. It turns out that back in 2015, Ildiko had a fling with a man named Gabor Pap, who lived not too far from the day spa. Gabor's wife, Elizabeth, was suspicious of her husband's impromptu outings and followed him one day. She caught him having sex with Ildiko at the spa. Gabor initially told Ildiko he was planning on leaving Elizabeth, but that wasn't exactly the case. So after this big blowout, Gabor stopped seeing Ildiko and stayed with his wife. Things seemed to be resolved until Ildiko reached out to Gabor 2 years after the dust had settled. In 2017, Elizabeth actually saw Ildiko driving past their home, and she decided she wouldn't be fooled. Twice, she contacted both Ildiko and Ronilo in an attempt to get Ildiko to back off. Elizabeth texted Ildiko these explicit photographs, which, by all accounts, appeared to depict Elizabeth and Gabor in a sexual manner. It was a way for Elizabeth to gloat to Ildiko about being the winner in this situation. Ronilo, on the other hand, received messages from Elizabeth demanding that he do something about his wife pursuing her husband. First, Elizabeth said, quote, "She almost destroyed my family. Enough is enough." But as recently as April 2018, which would have been just a month prior to the explosion, Elizabeth contacted Ronilo again, saying, quote, "Please ask your wife to stop contacting me or my husband. She did it again. Any contact from her is not welcome for us." When Ronilo suggested Elizabeth take some initiative by maybe blocking Ildiko on social media, Elizabeth was irate. She replied, "Really? You're so blind and accept what your wife is doing instead of stepping up. Be a man." But we know that there was an arrangement between Ildiko and Ronilo. It wasn't exactly his concern. Ildiko was apparently unfazed by Elizabeth's hatred. While Elizabeth seemed to have Ildiko in her crosshairs, Ildiko told her friends she wasn't even concerned about any risk to her safety. But that didn't matter. Investigators still called Gabor and Elizabeth in for interviews, and Elizabeth was open about how much she despised Ildiko. But the couple happily agreed for authorities to search their entire home and forensically analyze their cell phones. Even though Elizabeth had a motive, there was nothing to suggest that either she or her husband had the means or the capability to construct any kind of bomb, let alone one that would have killed Ildiko. Now, while all of this was going on, there was a surprising development. On May 26th, federal prosecutors just suddenly dropped the charges against Stephen. He was released. Authorities now admitted that, upon further examination of the IEDs, it wasn't clear whether they actually met the statutory definition for a destructive device under federal law. Therefore, Stephen was free to go. But, of course, investigators were still watching him like a hawk. However, publicly they were emphasizing they wouldn't be naming any suspects in the spa bombing until they had sufficient evidence to do so. Ildiko's loved ones were heartbroken, even though the charge hadn't even related in any way to her murder. All they saw was a man who could have been responsible and was getting away with something, and that made him more of a suspect in their eyes, especially Keanu. He had met Stephen once. It was during a family trip to Mexico the previous August. Well, he thought it was a family trip. It was incredibly upsetting when Keanu found out that instead of having quality time with his mom, his grandmother, and his uncle, he was actually going to be hanging out with his mom's boyfriend. He was really upset that Stephen had been invited. He wasn't a fan. So this made Stephen a potential suspect once again. Investigators knew they would find records of messages and calls between Stephen and Ildiko because they had this ongoing professional relationship. which is why it wasn't a surprise to find anxious text messages from Stephen to Ildiko, concerned that she would leave him. These were from early 2018, but the messages were a bit over the top, to say the least. When Ildiko asked Stephen for a little space, he threatened to take his own life. Yeah, so he wasn't taking it very well. It also didn't seem like things were exactly over either. Back in April, on April 22nd, after the breakup and after Stephen started dating Valerie, he texted Ildiko saying, "Building a relationship with you is the single most important period of my life. Ildiko, you rock my world. You are the woman that I've always dreamed of. I will love you forever." Days later, Ildiko texted Stephen back with, "Miss you. When do we get to cuddle?" And Stephen replied, "Miss you too. Love." So clearly both of them were still contacting one another on more than a business or friend level. Law enforcement also found photos on Stephen's phone from just before their breakup. They were taken on that vacation in Portugal. These were text messages that were exchanged between Ildiko and another man. Remember, Stephen said that he caught her being sketchy? Well, the texts were in Hungarian, not in English, and it wasn't immediately obvious what the pair were discussing. It turns out that the person Ildiko had been texting was that guy Laszlo in Sacramento. He was the man Ildiko had recently gone to Hungary with, and he was the one seen on that security footage at the San Francisco airport. Investigators quickly determined that Stephen had actually taken photos of these text exchanges so that he could have the messages translated. Clearly, Stephen wanted to know what Ildiko was discussing with this other man. Part of the text conversation involved Ildiko and Laszlo chatting about going dancing on their upcoming trip to Hungary. Well, we already know Stephen wasn't thrilled about Ildiko talking to another man, but this was all investigators had to go on at the moment. So they figured maybe they should do a background check on Stephen. Maybe that would either rule him out or confirm he had a motive to hurt Ildiko. So this is what they found. Stephen William Beal was born in 1959. He grew up in Long Beach, California with his family. He went on to obtain a business degree from Pepperdine University in 1978. By the time he met Ildiko, he had been a widower for 8 years, following the sudden and tragic death of his wife of 29 years and the mother of his 3 children, Christine. In February 2008, Stephen and his 48-year-old wife, Christine, had been moving a 49-pound end table down the stairs of their home. Christine was holding the lower end while Stephen was at the top. Suddenly, somehow, the couple lost their balance. Christine fell, and she was crushed under the weight of the table at the bottom of the staircase. Stephen had also fallen forward and ended up on top of this piece of furniture. After this freak accident, Christine didn't die immediately, but she was rushed to the hospital with critical hip and pelvis injuries. Over the next few weeks, she was in and out of the hospital for treatment from complications, and she ended up passing away in the ICU. Stephen was devastated. However, the hospital staff were concerned when Stephen decided to become uncooperative. He wasn't willing to provide information about Christine's medical history. He initially hadn't even told police that he was present when she fell. But Christine had told everyone after her fall that it was an accident. It was interesting to note that when Christine died, they found out in a toxicology report that she had a very high and unexplained concentration of lead in her body. Plus, it was revealed that just 6 weeks before this, Stephen had taken out an accidental death policy through his employer. Christine's autopsy report noted that her cause of death was pancreatitis, electrolyte imbalance, and other undetermined factors. Despite the manner of death being recorded by the coroner as undetermined, there was no evidence of foul play, and no charges were brought against Stephen in what appeared to be a tragic accident. Stephen later claimed Christine was poisoned due to their home's previous owner making fishing lures in the house. Recall that he too was on disability due to what he said was lead poisoning. Well, it emerged that 6 months before Christine's death, Stephen had purchased lead tetroxide, a chemical used as an orange-red pigment in paint designed for iron projects. I know this is a lot to take in. Is this a coincidence or something more? Christine's insurance company initially refused a payout in response to Stephen's claim for $21,000. The medical assessor noted that it was unlikely Christine had died solely by accident. In 2010, Stephen did ultimately win a $550,000 settlement after suing both his employer and the insurer, and received the money in March of 2011. Now, following Stephen's most recent arrest over the destructive device charge in May of 2018, the Long Beach Police Department decided to look back into Christine's death. But eventually, they concluded that they didn't find anything sinister that contributed to her passing. Investigators knew that Stephen had a professional background in management consulting, but he had been on disability for the past 10 years. He actually filed for bankruptcy in 2009, but this was discharged in 2015. There's absolutely no shame in being on disability. However, authorities found that it was very odd that Stephen was able to pursue his passion for acting. He uploaded a lot of audition reels to the internet. He invested a lot of money into acting classes. He'd even had some really minor parts in short films and movies. But I guess if you can't work due to medical reasons, it's important to have hobbies to fill your time and to make you feel fulfilled. To me, it pretty much looks like everyone here in LA, I think most of us have pursued acting at one point or another. But these videos were interesting because remember how I said the basis of Stephen's disability claim was his aphasia diagnosis? I told you it can cause severe communication difficulties. If his condition was so bad that he wasn't able to work, it's kind of difficult to see how he could possibly have been physically and cognitively able to pursue acting. Was Stephen fraudulently claiming disability by lying or exaggerating his symptoms? If so, this could be another way for law enforcement to charge him while they were still carrying out their investigation into the explosion. This was sort of buying them time, so to speak. As it so happened, investigators would get a chance to see Stephen in action on stage, and then they could determine how badly he was truly affected by the so-called aphasia. He was appearing in a local theater production of 12 Angry Jurors. It's a play off the movie 12 Angry Men, which is a crime thriller about a jury in New York City. It's a murder trial, and it's frustrating for all the jury members when a single member of the jury is skeptical, which forces them to carefully consider the evidence before making a decision. It's a very popular film. The FBI went along to see Stephen perform in this play, and while he wasn't going to be winning any Academy Awards anytime soon, he gave a very competent and entertaining performance. But was he a murderer? They couldn't prove that. Orange County Sheriff's Department Commander William Baker continued to urge the public to come forward if they had any knowledge of anything suspicious that could be linked to this bombing. We hear it all the time. Even the smallest or most insignificant piece of information can hold the key to a conviction. Investigators started combing through Stephen's financial records, and based on what they found at the crime scene, they worked really hard to find out if any of the components of the bomb could be linked to places in the local area that sold these items, which may have been purchased in the lead-up to Ildiko's murder. Detectives knew that the 9-volt battery had come from a CVS store, remember? But which one? When authorities learned that Stephen withdrew some cash from a local ATM about a week before the bombing, one officer realized that the bank was right down the street from a CVS. When he pulled the store's security footage, guess what? There was Stephen. He was buying a 9-volt battery with cash on May 8th. That was just days before the bomb went off. They went to a Staples store close by to the spa, and again he was seen on camera. This time, guess what he was purchasing? A 12x6 cardboard box. That cannot be a coincidence. The investigators didn't think so either. It was strikingly similar to the one that Lena had described seeing Ildiko open before the explosion. To be sure they were dealing with the same battery, investigators traced the one in the device to a shipment that arrived from China to the United States and was delivered to the CVS store, where Stephen was seen buying it. The last piece of the puzzle was eliminating every other individual who had purchased a 9-volt battery from CVS with the same serial number. Law enforcement was able to do this. Even though the wiring used in the device didn't appear to have been purchased by Stephen in the lead-up to the bombing, there were no meaningful differences between what they found and any of the previous wiring found in Stephen's garage. It could have been left over from rocket making. The footage taken from the cameras nearby the spa was also combed through. Finally, a clip from May 11th showed a vehicle resembling Stephen's Prius driving into the parking lot a block away from the spa and then pulling away not long afterward. But still, Stephen admitted to entering the premises while Ildiko was away. But why did he have to park far away from the building and kind of creep up? Of course, though, they needed more. Special agents covertly approached Stephen. Now Valerie, they needed her help. If Stephen could confess to anyone, it would probably be her. The agent showed her pictures of the aftermath and the images they had of Stephen purchasing the battery in the box. Would she agree to wear a wire and get Stephen to confess on tape? They were hoping so. At first, Valerie did not want to even entertain the idea that her fiancé was a murderer, but she knew Ildiko's family needed answers. If Stephen admitted to killing his ex, then she would have to deal with the fallout. And of course, why would you want to be with him if he did? By this time, law enforcement knew that Stephen wasn't as trusting or as unbothered by Ildiko's social life, and he lied to investigators about that. Ildiko's good friend Holly had told officers that one evening, when she was at dinner with Ildiko, Stephen got it in his head that Ildiko was cheating on him. He started texting Ildiko again and again and calling her. Then he came to the restaurant where they were eating dinner. It was obvious he was jealous and suspicious of what was going on. Other friends of Ildiko did not know Stephen's name, but they recognized him from photographs as someone Ildiko said she was scared of. She confided in her friends that she was scared he would stalk her and could seriously harm her, someone who was possessive and controlling. But even though this behavior is out of line, it didn't make Stephen a murderer, but it definitely contradicted the image he painted of himself that he'd given to investigators. This is why law enforcement was relying on Valerie. She and Stephen had a weekend getaway planned in Malibu, so the FBI struck a deal with her. They would pick up the tab for their accommodations if Valerie agreed to wear a wire. They also wanted to put a recording device in her car, bug her cell phone, and their room. There were 25 agents listening in the entire weekend. But to her surprise, whenever she brought up the subject of the bombing and Ildiko's death, Stephen didn't react at all. There was no emotional breakdown, no angry outbursts questioning why Valerie was raising such awful questions on their pleasant weekend away. Nothing about Stephen's reaction to Valerie discussing the bombing raised any concern. Unfortunately for Ildiko's family, the answers would come too late for her beloved mother, Juliana. In September of 2018, less than 6 months after losing her daughter, the 77-year-old passed away. From what we can tell, it appears that a joint funeral was held for her mother and daughter back in Hungary on October 26th, with Ildiko's brother expressing his profound thanks and sorrow on his social media account. Despite that sting operation not going the way the FBI had hoped, they weren't exactly back at square one. There were now too many things that made it impossible for Stephen not to be their guy, especially the way he voluntarily inserted himself into this case. Just days after the explosion, he did 10 hours of interviews on 3 separate occasions. It was clear to police that he was trying to determine early on what the investigators knew, and he also wanted to show them how smart he was. But if Stephen thought that putting himself in the sights of the authorities would make them cross him off the list, it didn't work. Instead, it firmly planted him in their minds as someone whose potential level of involvement warranted more attention, not less. The totality of the evidence made the case against Stephen compelling. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts. There he was on camera, buying not only a similar type of box used in the explosion, but the same battery from CVS. He had the know-how and the access to the chemicals required to build the same device. Despite his claims, he hadn't moved on from Ildiko at all. His text messages and his behavior showed what he was really like. On March 3, 2019, a month shy of the first anniversary of Ildiko's death, Stephen Beale was arrested again and held without bond. This time, it was for malicious destruction of a building, resulting in death. This new federal charge potentially carried a death sentence or life in prison without the possibility of parole. After conducting another search of Stephen's home and his vehicle, it was determined that chemical residue in his Prius matched what was found at the crime scene. This could be expected if he had used the vehicle to transport the bomb. At a press conference in the following days, U.S. Attorney Nick Hanna said this was a horrific, intentional attack that killed an innocent woman and severely injured two others. Those two surviving victims will have to live with the physical and emotional scars of this attack for the rest of their lives. He said he would do everything possible to secure justice for those victims and to bring the perpetrator to account for what they did. Ildeco's friend Irene spoke on behalf of the family again, saying, "We are pleased an arrest has been made after 9 long months. We continue to grieve the loss of Ildeco, as well as wrestle with the other implications of what appears to be Mr. Beale's horrific actions." At Stephen's indictment on March 13, 3 more felonies were added to his charge: the use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death, the use of a destructive device in relation to a crime of violence, and possession of an unregistered destructive device. The mass destruction charge carried a potential death penalty or life prison term, while the other 2 charges brought a maximum of 30 years and 10 years in prison. At his arraignment in Santa Ana, the 60-year-old pled not guilty to all counts. Things were about to get worse for the accused killer when, in February 2020, Stephen was charged with wire fraud, Social Security fraud, and the concealment of bankruptcy assets. Stephen stood accused of concealing $350,000 of the life insurance payout he received after Christine's death. Stephen was required to declare the money to the court in the terms of his bankruptcy, but he didn't. At the same time, the Department of Justice was still deciding whether to pursue the death penalty in the bombing case. In June of 2020, the prosecution finally announced that they would not be seeking the death penalty. Well, I guess that's one good thing for Stephen. The 63-year-old's trial finally got underway in June of 2022. The assistant United States attorneys told the court that this was a case about obsession, infatuation, and control. Despite Stephen telling investigators that things had ended amicably, and the fact that he'd only recently started dating Valerie at the time of the bombing, he had not moved on from his relationship with Ildeco at all. I actually thought that they had been together for a year from what Stephen had said and maybe broken up for some time, but I guess not. It was only in March of 2018, 2 months before Ildeco's spa was bombed, that she and Stephen took that trip to Portugal where he found out she was texting another man, and he couldn't handle it. He made it sound like this happened so long ago and he was okay with it all, but he wasn't. He was humiliated and he wanted to make her pay. If he couldn't have Ildeco, then nobody could. Ildeco's friends knew she was scared of Stephen and that he could harm her. He carefully planned his revenge in a way that he thought only he was smart enough to pull off. While Ildeco was away in Hungary, Stephen purchased the items he needed for that bomb. He constructed it at his home, and then he drove it to the spa on May 11th, so it was waiting for her when she returned. And he didn't care who else was hurt, even killed, as a result. The jury was also reminded that Ildeco's life wasn't the only one destroyed that day. It was a miracle that Lena and Elliot survived, but they had to live with the aftermath for the rest of their lives. In a letter to the court, one of the women said, "Fear has become my foundation, and worry my reality. I am a different, lesser version of who I used to be." While the mother and daughter may have been on the road to physical recovery, the psychological trauma would stay with them forever. It was a similar story for employees and clients of a mental health clinic which was situated opposite the spa. Many clients refused to return for treatment, and staff continued to suffer from PTSD. The jury heard that in Stephen's capacity as business manager, he had access to Ildeco's day spa schedule online, and he would have been able to see when she had clients. In the days leading up to the explosion, he had been checking the appointments day in and day out, using his own login details, as well as checking Ildeco's Facebook page to see when she got back into the country. If he did want to truly avoid harming anyone, it was too late to drive from the spot to Long Beach to retrieve the bomb. But he could have called Ildeco and told her not to touch the package, but he didn't. For the defense's case, they argued that both the investigators and the prosecutors were trying to make the evidence fit their theory that Stephen was responsible, rather than focusing on anyone else. They could be right, they zeroed in on Stephen from the beginning, and that is true. But there were reasons why. However, the defense said Max, the handyman, would have been one of the only people to know that the building's security cameras weren't working and was also sending Ildiko unwanted and uncomfortable text messages. They said it wasn't as cut and dry as Stephen being a vengeful ex who wanted to punish Ildiko. Remember, they were in contact, and Stephen was respectful and sentimental in multiple messages he exchanged with Ildiko following their breakup, and she reciprocated. There was proof that Ildiko was still open to meeting up with Stephen and being intimate, and this was very close in time to her killing. The defense claimed there wasn't a smoking gun in the form of abusive and threatening text messages or emails. It didn't show that Stephen was angry or vindictive enough to do what the prosecution was alleging. The defense even tried to explain away the battery purchase, saying that Ildiko used those same batteries in her spa equipment, so it wasn't unusual for Stephen to purchase one. Nor did they claim it was out of the ordinary for Stephen to have bought a cardboard box. He was in the middle of doing home improvement projects, and these boxes were required to store and move items while he was working. Finally, they argued that Stephen was only in the spa for 10 minutes on May 11th. He was there to check if there was enough room for a facial machine that Ildiko was bringing back from Hungary, which she was. After hearing 6 months of evidence that was collected from 66 witnesses, the jury went to deliberate. As the days dragged on without a verdict, things were not looking good for the prosecution. On August 22nd, there was finally a decision. It was a hung jury. 9 jurors thought Stephen was guilty, but 3 did not. While the jury felt Stephen had the means and opportunity to commit such a crime, not all of them could agree beyond a reasonable doubt that he had the motive or that the battery had indeed been one of the bomb components. So the judge declared a mistrial. There was no question for the prosecution. They knew they wanted to go straight back for a retrial, and Stephen remained in jail until they did so. On June 29, 2023, another trial began for Stephen. This time, the prosecution was led by U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada. They played a recreation video. It was filmed in a controlled outdoor space and used a mannequin to emphasize to the jury just how destructive this bomb had been, especially for someone who opened the box. The same type of device, chemicals, and electrical components were used. One of the most disturbing things about the recreation was that the mannequin was torn apart in a strikingly similar way to Ildiko's injuries. There was nothing left of the mannequin's arms, hands, and its legs had been severed. Compared to the crime scene photos of Ildiko's body parts, the comparison was chilling. Stephen's new attorneys again put Stephen's fiancée, Valerie, on the stand. She was the perfect person to refute the prosecution's narrative that Stephen was consumed by jealousy about Ildiko dating other men. If Stephen had moved on from his ex, why would he have gotten together with Valerie just weeks later? And why would he have proposed to her? Valerie testified that she never saw any signs that Stephen gave a second thought about Ildiko beyond his involvement in the business. She truly felt like he was innocent and had become convinced, even more so following the failed FBI sting. If Stephen had done this, she felt he would have confessed, but he didn't. Sadly, it wasn't until after Stephen's second trial that Valerie learned her boyfriend had still been texting Ildiko after they started dating. I can't imagine how humiliating that must have been, knowing that you're going to court and finally hearing these details. But of course, the reason Valerie didn't learn this earlier was that she was a witness. She wasn't allowed to know anything about the court proceedings. This deeply unpleasant and public revelation was the end of her and Stephen's relationship. She felt like a fool this time. When it came to deliberations, it took just 2 hours for them to reach a verdict. On July 19th, Stephen was found guilty on all 4 counts. Outside court, U.S. Attorney Martin Estrada said, using his expertise in explosives, Mr. Beale cowardly murdered his former girlfriend, permanently injured 2 other victims who were her customers, and risked the safety of many others in the area, including a daycare center across the street. Thanks to the thorough investigation by the FBI, Orange County Sheriff's Department, Orange County Fire Department, and other law enforcement partners, I'm pleased the jury saw through Mr. Beale's efforts to avoid responsibility for his deplorable actions. Of course, Stephen will still be facing those 2 separate federal fraud charges, But in early November 2023, he pleaded guilty. As part of his plea, Stephen admitted to receiving $1.3 million in disability and $350,000 in Social Security benefits while lying about having aphasia. At Stephen's sentencing on January 19, 2024, the very minimum he could expect to receive was the mandatory 30 years in federal prison. Many of Ildiko's loved ones addressed the court. Their pain was still very evident when they gave their victim impact statements. Her cousin Eva addressed Stephen saying, quote, "She was an amazing person who was loved by many. To me, she was a shining star. I looked up to her and loved her so much. I can have peace in knowing that you will finally get what you deserve. You have single-handedly destroyed my family." When Stephen himself addressed the court, he was not remorseful. He said, quote, "The only thing I can say is that I always have and always will maintain my innocence. I wish the person who committed this crime was sitting here and not me." Judge Stanton responded to this by noting the cruel and callous nature of Stephen's plan, describing him as likely to remain a danger to the public for the rest of his life. He wanted her dead simply because she didn't want to continue their romantic relationship. The defendant apparently decided revenge is a dish best served cold. The cold, calculating nature of the crime is chilling. Stephen was sentenced to 2 counts of life imprisonment, a consecutive 30-year prison sentence for the 3rd count, and a 10-year concurrent sentence on the 4th count. Ildiko's family was overjoyed at the decision. Outside court, her cousin Eva said, "After 5 years of waiting and wondering, our family and friends have peace in knowing that Mr. Beale will spend his remaining days in prison. She will live forever in our hearts and never be forgotten." Today, 64-year-old Stephen resides at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles. Federal prosecutors maintain that the circumstances surrounding the death of his late wife, Christine, are suspicious. What do you think about Christine? What do you think about whether Stephen did this or not? Just this year, in late January 2024, Stephen appealed both his conviction and sentence with the U.S. Court of Appeals. If his appeal is denied, Stephen will die in prison, as parole does not apply for his federal sentence. A restitution hearing is scheduled for April 12th for Judge Stanton to determine how much restitution Stephen will be ordered to pay to Lena and Ellie. That's because of the ongoing pain and suffering they continue to live with every day as a result of his actions. We hope for the sake of Ildiko's loved ones that things are resolved swiftly and they can focus on remembering what a warm, loving, and vivacious person she was. Someone who was living her life to the fullest and worked hard to make a success for herself. She set an incredible example for everyone around her. Her son, Keanu, continues to grieve the loss of his mother, but he honors her zest for life by focusing on positivity and recalling his mother's uplifting energy, which she encapsulated so well by once writing on the back of a treasured photograph, quote, "Life isn't always this happy, but you have to keep living on. I'm going to try." We engage with strangers on a daily basis. Every person is unknown to us before that initial conversation. Afterward, we might refer to them as acquaintances, friends, or even significant others. While we shouldn't live in fear of others, some individuals are monsters concealed behind friendly appearances. Unfortunately, for some, by the time they realize it, it's already too late. I want to introduce you to Rebecca Coaster. Her friends and her family refer to her as Becky and Becca, among other things like cute pet names, Becca Boo and Becky Boo, like her mom would call her. She was born on June 12, 1985, a June baby, like myself. Her mother, Barbara Miller, was beyond enamored, looking into her newborn baby girl's eyes for the very first time. Barbara said, "From the minute she came into this world, Becky was just the sweetest thing. I mean, look at those big, beautiful eyes, those cute, pouty lips, a head full of dark hair, and her olive skin. She was her mother's joy. She brightened her life in the world as soon as she entered it." As Becky got older, she remained with that sweet disposition and kind nature. Barbara noticed that Becky wouldn't even hurt the smallest creature. She said she couldn't even hurt a fly. When Becky was 9, her brother Damon was born, and that's when Barbara said the two of them became a trio, and it was a lot of fun. Barbara was very close to her children, especially Becky, having all those years with her before Damon came along. Her world revolved around giving Becky the best that she could. They were more than just mother and daughter, they were best friends. Barbara was a single mom until she met and fell in love with Larry Ross. They hit it off and had so much in common, and they were definitely very much in love. Both he and Becky had June birthdays, so many times the family would celebrate them together. Here is one of those birthday cakes, with Larry and Becky's picture on it. Larry considered Becky his daughter, even though he wasn't her biological father. The family was very close. Ultimately, Barbara Miller became Barbara Ross when she married Larry, and Becky looked gorgeous as she watched her mother exchange vows with Larry, now officially her stepdad. Becky and her mom loved roses. It was their favorite flower. Becky wore a pretty pink rose flower crown to her mother's wedding. Pink was also her favorite color. Many times she would wear pink eyeshadow, nails, jewelry, and heels. She was definitely a girly girl. She also loved butterflies. In these pictures you can just tell she radiates happiness. She and Damon look so adorable, and I can tell how excited Becky was for her mother's wedding. This embrace says it all. They just rocked back and forth, hugging on the dance floor, a little mother-daughter dance. They lived on Falcon Avenue in Medford. Larry worked as a truck parts salesman. Barbara worked shifts at the hospital, and Becky attended Medford High School, only a 99-minute drive from their house. And when she was 14 years old, she met Nicole Longo. Nicole was new to the area at the time, but she was so happy to have met Becky because they became inseparable. They were truly best friends, and over the years, they grew up together. Nicole called Becky her soulmate. She didn't think that soulmates only referred to someone's boyfriend, husband, or partner. Instead, Nicole believed that soulmates can be anyone with whom you have such a strong, unbreakable connection. And that's what these two girls had. They bonded over what most high schoolers do, sleepovers, where they would stay up all night talking to each other until they fell asleep. Walking around the neighborhood at night with other girls, just laughing, making memories, and inside jokes. Becky was a loyal friend. She was always there when you needed her, even if it was just to help pass some time in detention. Yes, she sat through Nicole's detentions with her, and that made them a lot more tolerable. Becky was always by her side through thick and thin. She was easy to get along with because she saw the good in everyone. She quickly merged into Nicole's friend group as well. At first, Nicole's friends from back home, like another friend, Nikki, were sad when Nicole moved away. But when she introduced Nikki to Becky, the move was worth it because they gained another amazing friend. Soon, the three of them became the two Nicks and Becca. Over the years, they formed a core group of friends and hung out all the time. Becky enjoyed helping others. It either came naturally to her, or it could have been something to do with her mom, because Barbara was a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, and it's not an easy job. It takes a lot of patience and being a very helpful, loving person who cares for others, and that's part of who Barbara was. That seemed to rub off on Becky. She would happily babysit her mom's friends' kids, help braid her friends' hair when they came over to hang out, and even babysit for her friends' kids in the summer as they got older and started families of their own. But Becky just had the look and the personality that left an impression on people, even those she barely knew. If you met her even once, you would remember her face. She was what people would call unforgettable. With that cute freckled face and bubbly personality, it definitely attracted the boys as well. Becky was no stranger to having boyfriends. The guys were always trying to flirt, talk, and date Becky. She was very popular and gorgeous, but humble. Her friends would tell her how pretty she was all the time and how other girls were jealous of her. But once they got to know her, they couldn't stay jealous because she was just too nice. After high school, Becky decided she wanted to work in the healthcare industry alongside her mom at the hospital. So she, too, studied to become a CNA, passed a test, and landed a job in the cardiology department at the same hospital in the same department as her mother. Becky and Barbara lived together, worked together, and hung out together. People saw them more like sisters than mother and daughter. When they weren't putting in the long hours at the hospital, they were shopping together, cooking, and curled up next to one another on the couch watching a movie. Becky always confided in her mother, and as she got older and more independent, she still made sure to keep in touch with her mom every single day. She let her know her plans, where she would be, when she would be coming home, and would call or text her when she got back from anywhere, running errands or going out with friends. She made even more friends at work. One of them was Jamie Redis, who was just drawn to Becky right away because of her bubbly personality. They became instant friends, and Jamie admired the way Becky treated every patient like it was her own family member. It showed that she was a genuinely loving person. In 2006, when Becky was 21, she dated a guy named Jay, but it didn't last that long. As Becky progressed in life, her standards got higher. Her friends would joke when they went out that they only talked to guys who had business cards. They were just being cute and cheeky, but Becky was known for her witty banter, cracking jokes, and making her friends laugh. She was the friend that would get out there on the dance floor by herself and do silly things to make everyone smile. She made things fun.